Armour is a very layered and complex topic. Of course, you have the flashy stuff on the outside, however, you also have the stuff on the inside. Of course, padding in armour is very important, and maybe equally as important as the armour on the outside in certain circumstances. However, people tend to dramatically overestimate the amount of padding worn under armour and actually required under armour, so much so that it full up becomes impractical. And I get actually quite a few comments saying that my impressions in ancient Greek warfare are wrong because I don't have very much padding. So why is it that ancient Greek armours don't have that much padding? When many people are talking about padding under armour, they're coming from a medieval lens. Typically a 15th century lens or late 14th century lens, and projecting that onto a Hellenic style of warfare. The problem is, medieval warfare and Hellenic warfare are two incredibly different styles of warfare. Though yes, we certainly see padded jacks and other forms of padded garments worn under medieval armour, that can't be directly transferred over to the ancient Greeks. People also tend to dramatically overestimate the amount of padding required under medieval armour as well. Toby Capwell's actually talked about this, and essentially if you have too much padding, it actually starts to make armour impractical. For one, you get a hell of a lot hotter. The padding is hotter than the actual armour itself, of course, because it actually is more like a coat. And also it moves the armour further away from your body and further away from your joints, which means that the closer fitting the armour is, the more like your own version of a second skin it behaves, the further away it's separated by padding, the harder it is to move actually with your body. So there is also, even in a medieval context, people tend to overestimate the amount of padding, the thickness of padding actually required for it to be practical. But in a Hellenic style of warfare and a Hellenic style of armour, we see basically no padding. And why? Why is that the case? There are a few reasons for this. Primarily, the style of warfare, the weapons that we are facing, are incredibly different in 500 BC than 1400 AD. Ancient Greek armour is quite famously light and close-fitting, which can give us a lot of sort of insight into the style of warfare that it's being used in, of course. Contrast that to the medieval period, you see up to 150-pound weight longbows, you see two-handed pole hammers, you have weapons which deliver a lot more shock impact force than you do in the ancient world. The vast majority of attacks that I'm going to be facing when I'm in this style of armour is a little spear poke, right? Or maybe a lighter, thinner Persian arrowhead that's going to hit me. And this armour would have been very effective against 90% or so, as a rough guess, attacks that it has to deal with, if that attack bypasses my shield, which of course is a massive factor. Contrast that to the later medieval period. Of course, shields are starting to be dropped by fully armoured individuals, which means that they're fully relying on armour essentially to protect them by blocking and dodging the actual impact. And you're facing far higher poundage weapons and far more sort of blunt impact weapons than you do in the ancient world. That of course means that your armour has to have more shock absorption capability than is required for a Hellenic context. Another massive factor is that in ancient Greece, I'm in a very hot climate. Padding is what's going to make you overheat more than armour itself. It is layers of fabric, very similar to a coat, that is going to trap heat in, make you sweat, dehydrate you a lot quicker than wearing plate. And heat stroke could potentially be a full death sentence in the ancient battlefield. If you get dizzy, you start to black out, the likelihood is that you won't really be seeing again after that. So armour is typically very light and very close-fitting in an ancient Greek context with not very much padding. However, that is not to say that there were no padded elements worn with ancient Greek armour. We have plenty of evidence suggesting that helmets and greaves and other items were lined with leather. We have stitch holes going around the outside for a simple leather lining. And this is really all that you need. People also dramatically underestimate the poofiness of the chiton. The chiton is a very full garment. It fills out and pads out your cuirass massively. That in its own offers a great amount of shock absorption because it is essentially layers of fabric without the need for a high density gambeson type structure. And of course we see padding in helmets. In fact, we see the most amount of padding in helmets, but even still, these helmets are supposed to be very, very close fitting. We have Aristotle talks about sea sponge that can be used to pad helmets. We have archaeological Etruscan finds of grass-woven caps likely used in the ancient Greek world as well. And likely the most common was a simple felted pilos hat, just a felted hat to be worn inside. But even still, we're not looking at mass amounts of padding here. When the impact that my armour is dealing with, the threat that my armour is dealing with, isn't delivering as much force as a 2,000 year later weapon, then of course the armour is going to be designed to be used in the style of warfare that the armour is being used in. I'm not coming up against mounted knights with lances delivering horse level of impact into my body, potentially. I'm dealing with smaller swords, lighter swords, spear poking, and through testing this armour, which we have done practically, it holds up incredibly well. It would save your life very easily. Most attacks wouldn't even penetrate it, from what our test showed, with sort of the most powerful stabs going through less than a millimetre. It's not even really enough to poke through your underclothing, if at all. This style of armour would have protected me from what I needed it to 90% of the time. My main source of defence also isn't the armour, it's my shield. So they have to bypass my shield and then bypass my armour to actually directly affect me. And that's not to say that exceptions didn't happen. We do have archaeological finds of helmets and cuirasses with holes in them likely caused by spears, possibly someone lying on the ground and getting stabbed by a butt spike. We have a breastplate with sort of a square hole very much fitting of a soriter, so maybe a fallen enemy who's sort of spiked in the ground. Of course, that would have a lot more impact because the body can't give. But the need for padding is dramatically overestimated when we're talking about, I would say, armour in general, but especially a Hellenic context. It's used in a different context to medieval armour. Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it and found it a little bit interesting. If you'd like to support the channel, then I just actually started a Patreon page and also, of course, YouTube memberships. A special thanks to our channel members who continue to support the channel. If you're not interested in either of those or can't afford to do so, absolutely no problem at all. Liking and subscribing is an awesome help, and also just sharing these videos around to our niche little audience here on the internet does great deeds as well. So thanks very much for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one.
Noroff gir deg
Prøv Norvegia smaksrik. Med enda mer av smaken alle elsker. For håpe du rekker en skive eller to, da. Norvegia smaksrik. Enda mer av smaken alle elsker.
The ancient Greek hoplite is a very iconic figure in our histories. However, the archaic hoplite often gets overlooked for those of the early classical. And for me personally, the archaic hoplite is a far cooler version from style to even style of warfare than the classical hoplite is. Today we're going to take a look at this more overlooked era of hoplite history, being the sort of mid to late archaic period, pre-Persian Wars, and see how a well-armoured hoplite of that period was armed. Now, the first piece of armour that you'd actually put on are your greaves. For that, I have to have my sandals off, and I'm also going to wear some felted socks. Now, we actually do have evidence of felted socks being worn in this period. However, there's quite a big shoe debate about ancient Greeks regarding did they wear shoes, did they not. I found these to be very helpful with greaves and the foot armour that we'll be putting on later, and we do have evidence for them in the period. And for us modern people who maybe don't go around barefoot a lot, socks are very much a welcomed addition to our panoplies. These go on just like regular socks, like so, and then these greaves are what we call anatomical greaves, which means that they are designed to fit basic human anatomy, quite in a stylized way. We do also see in this period non-anatomical greaves. This is sort of when we start to see the anatomical armour kicking off. This, I suppose you could say, is the transitional period, sort of quite a broadly speaking area of time, but where you start to see the transition from non-anatomical armours to anatomical armours. These are self-clamping, which means they don't need to be fastened by straps or buckles. We do sometimes see greaves with the ability to be fastened, but this seems to be the most standard. And it can be a little uncomfortable, you just sort of have to go through it, but you essentially slot it on. And slided up your legs. With the socks, really makes the world of difference because it doesn't bite into your ankle, which it otherwise would do. And you can sort of see how quick and easy that is to put on, and that stays on really, really well. And same for the other leg. Something else that we see in the archaic period, which is what I'm going to go to next, is the addition of other pieces of armour that we don't see in the classical period, which are for whatever reason dropped. That includes sabatons, anatomical in this case, and also thigh armour, or your medieval terminology, your komun. We see these depicted in art. We have a few archaeological finds, and these are essentially what protects your thighs. And this is something that I think is so cool about the archaic period hoplite, is that we essentially see an entirely armed individual, even in some cases upper and lower arm armour. You have essentially full plate armour in the 6th century or in the 7th century BC. This level of armament doesn't really reappear in the historical timeline until the medieval period. So it's really, really cool for me that you have that sort of ancient Greek style in a full plate harness. Now, there's a little bit of assumptions going into this style of armour. We don't know how they were worn. Originally, I made these so that they were self-clamping. They eventually slipped. So what I've essentially done is I've made, very similar to medieval period, an arming belt. And that's how I'm going to wear these. Do them up as a belt, and then they'll be buckled around my legs. However, we also seem to see similarly self-clamping as well. But I think it's highly likely that an arming belt was worn. It was worn for later periods that wore the same piece of armour, essentially, and through everyone that I know who have recreated thigh armour, some sort of suspension system has been needed. And for your sake, I won't show you putting this on, as I'm going to have to reveal quite a bit. So I've now got the thigh armour on, and they'll stay up quite well, and they obviously protect the thighs. And again, this is a really interesting piece of armour that we see dropped around 500 BC. You'll probably see it lingering a little bit after that. But this really only existed for maybe 100 years, 70 years, that we see in the artistic record and archaeological record. And then this sort of extra limb armour, arm armour, thigh armour, foot armour, just completely drops out of use. And we don't really know why this happened. There's a few reasons to that, which we'll probably get onto later. But the next piece of armour that we'll put on are shoes and then the sabatons. It's always easier to armour your legs before you then come up onto the torso. So now that all the sandals are laced, we come to actually one of my favourite pieces of armour, that being the sabatons, the foot armour. And these are really, really interesting. These are based on a find currently housed in the British Museum. And these I just think are so neat, because it's like, we need to find a way to protect our feet. So we are literally going to make metal feet with little hinged toes. And they just have a very simple sort of strapping method. There's a strap that goes underneath, and then a strap that goes around the ankle. And the curve of that foot comes right up snug against the curve of the greave, which means there is very, very little gap to be exploited. My feet are really, really well protected, and your feet and legs are really one of the only spots ever exposed in hoplite style warfare, and really one of the only targets, apart from the head, if you are well armoured. And I think it's really, really interesting why these pieces of armour fell out of use. And it's a theory, and it's a discussion that we can't really answer. We don't know for sure. I don't think they would have been impractical, as through our sort of tests and sparring that we've done, I found that having this leg armour has been a massive advantage to me. I did have an issue where, and I think this is probably likely why we start to see these additional pieces of armour drop out of use, is at the recent event at Fort Loudon, just over a week ago, 2 weeks ago, we did a very, very long march, about a 3-hour march, and I went in full panoply, and I found that after about an hour and a half, and I didn't realise this, my feet, sabatons, came loose, which obviously isn't ideal. And that was when I was not wearing my socks, and they rubbed my the roof of my foot raw. And I think that might be an issue, is these things are sort of impractical on the march, on large campaigns, And in the archaic period, we see, you know, far more smaller style engagements. We don't really see large military campaigns in the archaic period nearly as much as the classical. It would have been far easier for me to, you know, sort of chuck this on a wagon, or have one of my sort of slaves or servants carry this for me, as opposed to when you were going on longer campaigns, it becomes, you know, a little bit more difficult to transport these extra pieces of kit. You have to take, you know, more rations, more materials with you, because you're going to be campaigning for a longer period of time, as opposed to, you know, just the weekend across to the next polis. So that is my legs fully armoured, and as you can see, I'm really, really well protected. And that's even without an addition of a shield. My feet are covered, my shins are covered, my thighs are covered. There are very, very few areas that you will be able to get me on my legs, and I'm still very mobile, okay? You don't really get too impacted in your mobility when you have leg armour. And this is, again, just one of the reasons why I love this sort of era of Greek armament, is, of course, this wasn't universal. This would have been a very aristocratic hoplite. This entire panoply is based on a Laconian bronze figurine, so likely a Spartiate, so very, very aristocratic member of society. You would have still seen hoplites, you know, basically just affording bare minimum, no body armour. And you see this sort of prime, fully equipped hoplite. The panoplites is often what we sort of see described, which means men with all the equipment as opposed to just equipped men. And you can sort of really see why. You have that full panoply. And again, I'm not even as fully armoured as I could be, as I don't have upper and lower arms. Next is probably my favourite piece, maybe second favourite piece of the panoply, that being the cuirass or cuirass. This is what is known as a transitional cuirass. It's sort of in an early stage development from the more archaic bell cuirass to the more classical muscle cuirass. So you still see the more characteristics of the bell. You have the sort of swirled chest, which I think looks really, really awesome. You have the actual bell shape. The shaping of this cuirass is very much more bell than muscle cuirass, but you start to see that anatomy sort of coming in to this cuirass, that sort of transitional period. This is sort of categorized, this panoply, as a transitional panoply, which is quite a large span of time. So, you know, this is dated to around 550 BC, 530 BC. You would sort of still consider the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 to be the transitional period. So it is really quite a blurry transition. This is a really, really interesting armour in the way that it is attached to you. On the right side, your most exposed side, you have pins. However, the pins are actually on the inside and they remain fastened. On the other side, you have a lip on both top and the bottom that the front cuirass slots into. That is then tied at the bottom by a loop. Now, this is really, really interesting because it essentially allows you to actually grow in to shrink and expand the armor, which means if I'm wearing perhaps more padding or more underclothing, a thicker chiton, I actually have about 1.5 inches, 2 inch leeway. If you happen to put on a little bit of extra weight, you have a little bit of leeway in how well you can make this armor fit you. Then on the top of the armor, you have a very simple pin. So there's a pin on the back plate that the front plate overlaps and basically just clicks into like a Lego brick. This probably is possible to put on by yourself. I haven't experimented with that enough, so I'm going to go and get some help to put this on and then come back and show you it on. So now I've got the cuirass, I hope you can hear me okay. My microphone's probably in here a little bit somewhere. These cuirasses are really important that they fit properly, and with the bell cuirass you get excellent mobility with these things because of the design. It rests on my natural waist. I can lower my shoulders and the cuirass won't move. A cuirass should not be sitting on your shoulders. That means it is not fitting you properly. It should hug very much around your center of mass, your waist. And it ends at my natural waist. So my belly button ends about, and it flares out into why it's given the very characteristic bell name. The bell cuirass is because it has this bell waist. And this is actually quite a shallow bell, and more like pure bell cuirasses we see almost like a tutu, like a full flanged out piece like that. But this still protects me, right, from anything coming down to about here, but it allows me excellent mobility in flexion. Now I actually find that the coeses interfere more because it actually hits like that, but otherwise, you know, you can flex very, very easily with a cuirass that's fitted properly with a nice bell. I can move far better in this than I can actually with my later muscle cuirass that comes down a little bit further. Next is your sidearm. In this case, I have what is called a kapps. It literally means chopper. This is a sword idealized for cutting. It has its center of percussion moved further up due to the leafing of the blade, which allows very powerful slashes. The kapps wouldn't be the only sword that you'd see in this period. We would also have seen the xiphos, which is more of a leaf-shaped blade. You see in the later periods a very, very short, almost dagger. Otherwise, it's of similar length, but more of a multi-tool used for stabbing and slashing. Of course, you can still stab with a kapps, but it is optimized as a slashing weapon. And this is worn deliberately very high up on the body, about rib height. This is very different to later swords in the medieval period, for example, that are typically worn down on the hip. This is for a couple of main reasons. One, it's a smaller sword, so I can have it sort of tucked up there and it sort of remains out of the way. It also allows for when I am using this in conjunction with a shield, which I would always be doing, if I get in a tight press situation, I can grab this very easily. If my shield is pressed and I'm compacted, to grab down here is not very easy. It's far easier and I expose myself far less if I draw it that way as opposed to having to pull it out here. Also keep in mind I'm basically shoulder to shoulder with people around me or very, very close to people around me, and drawing like that is going to impact them more than if I sort of draw like that. All right, the next piece of armor that I put on is probably the most characteristic, of course, the helmet. This is what is called a Myros Corinthian helmet. This is more of an archaic styled helmet. And this seems to be very popular in and around the Peloponnese, possibly due to being manufactured by a Peloponnesian workshop. And we have a little bit of evidence linking this actually to use in Sparta, which is really, really cool. And that's basically just categorized by this slight notch in the ear. But otherwise, it's decently similar to other Corinthian helmets of this period. You pad it out with an arming cap of some sort. We have evidence of sea sponge being used. I believe Aristotle tells us about a sea sponge. We have archaeological Etruscan finds of a grass woven hat. Otherwise, probably what was most common was a felted pilos hat, something that you wear in with the helmet. And this helmet is very, very light. And that's something that we see time and time again with Hellenic armours of all types, is that they are very close-fitting, they are relatively thin, and they are very, very light. And this can give us a lot of indication into the style of warfare that these guys would be fighting in, and why they make certain stylistic and practical changes with their armour. For instance, these helmets were likely made originally from a casted front and then worked out in one piece, with the fronts often left thick. We even sometimes see as drastic as 10mm nasals with like 0.5mm on the back. This one is also accurate in the sense that it's pretty much uniform. It's 2mm in the front and 0.8mm in the back, but we often see the front being thickened and the back left thinner. And this can also be seen in archaeological records of we often see the back of helmets with a big hole because it's a thinner metal. Now next would be the shield, but I'm going to go and turn our attention to spears. You will see I have two spears here, a little bit different to one another. I'm not sure if this one's in frame. You have the very stereotypical and famous dory used by the hoplites, which is around, this one's on the shorter side, about 7.5 feet. We typically see 7 to 9 feet or around 2.5 meters. And double-ended, it has the iron acme at the front and the bronze soriter on the back. It does a few things. It acts as a counterweight. I can hold the spear a lot further back than forward, which gives me more reach. Also, it can be used very helpfully to allow the spear to stand up straight, which is honestly one of my favourite things for it. It can be used to dispatch fallen enemies on the ground. This is a archaic style spear. You will notice it is significantly shorter. This is maybe around 6.5 feet, or around 2 meters. It is single-ended, does not have a serrator on the back. And you'll also notice this here, which is called an ankyle. Something that's really, really interesting that we see in the archaic period is 2 spears being brought to battle that doubled as javelins. So these guys were throwing, right? Almost certainly these guys were throwing spears. They were, you know, a lot looser in style of warfare. We have artistic depictions of hoplites with, you know, rock throwers and javelin throwers standing directly behind them. The archaic period seems to be far less structured and far less of a dense, compact phalanx than that of the classical period. And we see hoplites throwing spears, and it's very, very awesome to see. The Che Guevars is one of the best that show this. But essentially, you have your aspis in this hand. In that aspis, you can also hold another spear very easily, and you can throw this one. So the ankyle is essentially a booster for when you throw a javelin or a spear. It essentially allows you to get a little bit of extra oomph for the throw. It essentially slings it. And some tests have shown that it can add an additional third of range to a throw. And you have to keep in mind as well, I'm not necessarily wanting to line up and do Olympic-style javelin throws. That's going to expose me quite a lot. It's going to be a little bit awkward for me to do when I'm fully kitted up. So I can, with the addition of an ankyle, remain pretty covered and still deliver a pretty powerful throw with the addition of the ankyle without having to make it a full body explosive motion. It's actually quite unclear when we start to see the dory emerge as a weapon used by the hoplites, but it's likely that this kit would have overlapped with it as well. So it's sort of neat. I typically use the dory more at our events because most people are representing classical hoplites, but it's also cool to show the different styles and spears that we see as well. And as you can see, this is a fully kitted up archaic hoplite. I'm incredibly well armoured. I am very, very well armoured. And that's even without my upper arm and lower arm armour, which also existed in the period. And you can see how covered I am with the addition of the shield. You know, this was the knight of the ancient Greek battlefield. This is pretty much as armoured as you get, historically speaking. You only really top this in the 15th century and 14th centuries. This is incredibly well armoured, and you have the addition of a very large shield. And that's something that's so interesting when we look at the archaic period, is we often see these extra bits of armour which get, you know, dropped off. We see the bell sort of flaring out, and we see far more missile weapons in the style of warfare. It is highly likely that lots of these extra additional pieces of armour were to combat the extra thrown threats. The bell waist would do a very good job at stopping projectiles from coming down and hitting me. It's not just direct hits that you're having to worry about in this period of warfare where you're having to face against a lot of missile troops. It's ricochets, it's deflections, it's arrows bouncing off of shields, it's rocks bouncing off the guy next to me. Therefore, that explains why we often see a lot of extra pieces of armour, is because you're not even just having to defend from more weapons coming at you in general, you're having to defend yourself more from, you know, unseen threats, ricochets, bouncing, that, you know, otherwise could lacerate you or cut you. These extra bits of limb armour sort of help neglect that. And again, they're very, very thin. These armours aren't 3mm. This cuirass and stuff like that, we see, you know, around a millimetre thick. Which is still very, very good at stopping stabs. You've tested it practically. A bronze cuirass, you're not stabbing through. You're just not. If you break through, you're going through less than a millimetre, not enough to maim the person at all. But this armour can tell us a lot about the style of warfare that we're likely seeing in this period. You are seeing lots of missiles. You were seeing, more individualistic combat. You're not seeing as tightly packed as a phalanx as you would in the classical period. You're seeing javelin men and missile men in the ranks of the hoplites. You're seeing hoplites themselves throwing missiles. You're seeing probably a lot more one-on-one style sparring, sort of a little bit of a bridge between Homeric era combat of more one-on-one duels and classical mass formational battles. The Archaic period is likely sort of a bridge between those. It's such an interesting period of history. I think the coolest looking armor of all time for me personally. I love the style and the option as well of having full plate. I think is just absolutely awesome. And the style of warfare is super interesting as well. There's so many mysteries that we can't quite answer. We have these little clues that point us to assume these things. But yeah, overall, this is an archaic hoplite armed almost to the full ability. Again, you might just see some upper and lower arms, but you would also see hoplites, many of them armed less than this in this period. This would have been very, very well armored for the time. What do you think? What is your era, your favorite era of ancient Greek armament? Is it the archaic period like mine? Is it the classical? Is it the Hellenistic? Let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it and learned something. If you have any questions about the panoply, feel free to leave them down below. I'll try my best to answer them. And if you'd like to support the channel further to help out this a little bit more, then we do have channel memberships that you can join. Special thanks to our channel members who continue to support the channel. Your support truly does mean a lot. And I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Thanks very much for watching.
Over 4,000 years ago, something remarkable began in southern Iberia. The ancient Chalcolithic societies there came to an end, and in their place emerged a powerful society that came to dominate the region for over 600 years. They lived in densely populated, fortified hilltop settlements, protected by strong walls and even higher towers. As well as homes, they had workshops, granaries, and large meeting halls. This was a strictly hierarchical society ruled by powerful chieftains, or perhaps kings and queens, supported by a wealthy aristocracy, a labouring class, and slaves. As well as their magnificent settlements, we know about the society because of their burial tradition. They interred their dead beneath the buildings of the settlements, in pits, stone boxes, or in enormous ceramic jars. They were buried with standardized sets of grave goods that marked their age, sex, and social rank within this society. The elite men were always given copper and bronze weapons, while the elite women wore gold or silver jewelry and sometimes beautiful silver diadems. They had trade links that extended across the Mediterranean to North Africa, the Aegean, and the Near East, and all the way across Europe to the Baltic. And thanks to the latest in ancient DNA analysis, it's now possible to reconstruct not only the population level ancestry of these people, but also the relationships between the individuals buried in this intriguing way, shedding light into the kinship practices and social organization of this Bronze Age society. So who were these people? Where did they come from? And how did they exert such tight control over their population and their culture for 6 centuries? And what ultimately led to their downfall. This is the amazing story of the Bronze Age rulers of Spain, what some have called the first state society in Western Europe, the El Agar culture. Later in this video, we'll be talking about how genetic testing has helped to reveal not only the ancestry of the El Agar people, but their family relationships too. If you've ever wanted to find out about your own ancestry, then I'm pleased to tell you that on this video I've partnered with MyHeritage, a leading global family history and DNA service that makes exploring your family history easier than ever. The MyHeritage DNA test is easy to use. When you get the box, you do a simple cheek swab. It takes just 2 minutes, and then you send it back. The results help you to discover your origins and find new relatives. I've done this, and I'm happy to share my results. It gives you an ethnicity estimate by a percentage breakdown of your origins across 42 supported ethnicities and over 21,000 geographical regions. You can see mine is mostly English and almost a quarter Irish, which makes sense as most of my family is from England and I had an Irish grandmother. 23% Scandinavian, though, was a real surprise. But then I have found out from doing my family tree with MyHeritage that my ancestors worked in shipping on the northeast coast of England, so perhaps that's where those links were made. And I wonder where that small amount of Iberian ancestry came from. Whatever the answer, it's interesting, considering the topic of this video is ancient Iberia. I'll have to explore these links further, and MyHeritage helps you find new relatives based on your shared DNA. You can see how much DNA you share with them and what their degree of relatedness is, and ancestral surnames common to you both. There's also this new feature called Theory of Family Relativity, where you might also find out where a DNA match could fit in your family tree. If you want to find out about your own ancestry like I have with MyHeritage, then please click the link in the description box to buy a DNA kit. Use the coupon code DAN for free shipping, and as an added bonus, you can start a 30-day free trial of MyHeritage's best subscription for family history research. Thank you to MyHeritage for sponsoring the video. The societies of Chalcolithic Iberia are epitomised by the wonderful site of Los Millares in Andalusia, with its dispersed round houses and famous perimeter walls, which thrived for about 1,000 years between 3200 and 2200 BC. Then quite suddenly, archaeologically speaking, these societies of southern Iberia came to an end and something new began in their place. So what caused this? Well, a fantastic 2021 paper that analysed DNA from human remains around this time helps to shed light on what happened. It looks like that starting around 2400 BC, new people moved into Iberia from the north, and by 2 centuries later, their descendants were in southern Iberia. The men were carrying the R1b Y haplogroup, and they were also associated with genes originating on the Eurasian steppe centuries earlier. And after 2200 BC, the male lineages of Chalcolithic Spain, those dating back thousands of years here, came to an end and were replaced almost exclusively by the R1b Y haplogroup. Now, the researchers can't say for sure whether the new arrivals took advantage of societies that had already collapsed due to internal problems, or if they caused the collapse themselves. But to me it seems like a tribe of Bell Beaker culture men from northwest Europe steadily took over Iberia, extinguishing the existing male lineages in the process, while taking wives from the existing Iberian population. In fact, for the rest of the Bronze Age, basically every man in Iberia would carry variations of the R1b Y haplogroup, descending from a subclade originating in Central Europe. And then from 2200 BC, we see the beginning of the El Agar culture being established in the southeast. This was a new way of life, not like the earlier Chalcolithic societies, and not entirely like the Bell Beaker culture either. For one thing, they didn't use those bell-shaped ceramic beakers like their ancestors did throughout much of Western Europe. So what was the El Agar culture, or the Agaric culture, exactly? Well, from 2200 BC, in southeast Iberia, these people established hilltop settlements, ranging from 1 to 6 hectares in size. The name of the culture comes from the site of El Agar, one of the most powerful and important settlements. Their settlements weren't just made up of houses, but included storage rooms, especially for barley, as well as workshops and meeting halls. Some of these buildings were several stories high. They also had fortifications and infrastructure like huge reservoirs.
Hos Coop Rix får du nå 2 1,5 liter sprudle for bare 20 kroner. Husk at du får mer ut av sommeren når handleturen fort gjort.
The story of El Agar as a society is one of increasing complexity, growth and sophistication over the centuries. This is reflected in the settlements themselves. One of the most important settlements was a site known as La Bastida in Murcia, which covers 4.5 hectares on a hill 450 meters above sea level. Initially, between about 2200 and 2025 BC, the original buildings were small oval or circular huts, kind of like those at Los Millares, but also like some Bell Beaker culture houses from the rest of Iberia. It's hard for the archaeologists to know too much about this first phase there, because around 2025 BC, large parts of the settlement were destroyed by fire. The most interesting thing about this first phase is the massive fortifications they built to protect the settlement. The stonework walls, made from quarried sandstone blocks and clay mortar, were up to 3 meters wide and 5 to 6 meters high originally. That's 20 feet tall. In fact, some sections are still 4 meters high today. The walls were plastered with a yellow or violet bluish clay. What's more, the wall had these square, solid towers protruding from it. Wall towers had been seen on Chalcolithic defences like at Los Millares, but they were much further apart from one another. This is because the primary weapon used then was the bow and arrow. Warfare in the El Agha culture, however, did not rely on bows, but on hand-to-hand weapons. The men defending the walls from these towers would have had to knock attackers off the walls with spears and halberds. There was a very narrow entrance with large wooden doors that opened into a passageway leading into the settlement. These are sophisticated defences meant to slow and channel attackers. There's nothing like this at this time anywhere closer than the Eastern Mediterranean. And they built these defences right away. It was the first thing these people did upon arriving in this place and making it their home. Clearly, Iberia in 2200 BC was an incredibly violent place, and right from the start, the El Agha elites could command a huge amount of labour. But their society became increasingly sophisticated and complex over the centuries, which is reflected in the architecture of their settlements. After the first phase at La Bastida burned down in 2025 BC, over the next 100 years, the settlement was fully reorganised with stone buildings, some of them monumental, and they built a huge reservoir that could hold over 300,000 litres of water. The final stage at La Bastida, from 1900 to 1550 BC, saw a dense layout of stone buildings of markedly different sizes, all packed in close to each other with just a few narrow alleys between them. It makes you wonder what living here would have been like. Everything going on would have been hidden away and private. Uggaric society was characterised by this kind of control of resources and people, physically and socially. The hilltop sites like La Bastida were the homes of the elites and those that served them. There were perhaps 1,000 people living here. It's also likely these sites housed slaves for work like grinding the barley into flour and perhaps weaving textiles. But that's not where all the people of this society lived. There were other settlements in the lowlands and plains that were subservient to the power centres controlling them. La Bastida, for example, likely controlled a vast territory of over 3,000 square kilometres. Resources from the region, like barley or cattle, were collected and brought to the hilltop sites for storage and redistribution. Other lowland sites specialised in metalworking or textiles before the finished products were brought to the homes of the elites. These hilltop sites, like La Bastida and Lorca and El Agha itself, were probably the capitals of state-level polities. All the elite hilltop settlements shared the same funerary ritual, characterised by burial underneath buildings. The bodies were placed in stone kists, artificial caves cut into the bedrock, large ceramic urns, or in simple pits. They were usually individuals, but some had 2 bodies together and occasionally there were 3 or more. These customs were surprisingly standardised, with different specific grave goods depending on sex, age and social class. So what can these marvellous burials tell us about these people and their society? I've mentioned that control is one of the aspects that stands out for this society, and that's expressed in various ways in their material culture, most of all in objects like the pottery and jewellery included in the burials. They had just 8 types of pottery, all undecorated, and the forms were standardised over 600 years across the entire geographical range of the culture. They were all made from the same kind of clay too. Imagine the level of cultural control exerted over the workshops producing these objects. No deviation was allowed. Imagine the authority and the confidence of the people in charge. One of the most outstanding kinds of pottery is the huge pithoi storage jars with a capacity of between 100 and 200 litres. These were used primarily to hold grain in central, sometimes fortified storage rooms. In this arid environment, they grew almost exclusively barley. I'll talk more about this at the end of the video, but the centralisation of the food supply for each region is one way, perhaps the most important way, that they exerted their control. The other pottery style that stands out is these famous goblets, basically bowls above a tall stem. They are thought to be involved in rituals and are associated with the richest graves. We know that Belbeka societies, especially those in Iberia, involved ritual drinking, and other Bronze Age European societies also developed drinking rites. We see special cups from England and Denmark to Greece. Probably these communal rites included the swearing of oaths between, say, a king and his warrior retinue, or between two political leaders, and maybe to seal alliances at weddings and the like. More about that in a minute. As well as pottery, people were buried with metal objects like halberds and daggers initially, and later on swords, as well as axes, awls and chisels, and ornaments like bracelets, earrings, rings, beads, and later, and rarely, the world-famous diadems. The specific system of grave goods distribution tells us about how society was organised, at least within the hilltop settlements, the regional capitals. 10% of the burials represent the elite class, the rulers. Then 50% represent the middle class, and the remaining 40% are the lowest class, who are buried with just a pot, and some perhaps representing slaves who were buried with nothing. Initially, the tools and weapons were arsenical copper, and after about 1800 to 1700 BC, they began to use tin bronze too. Silver and more rarely gold were used for the jewellery produced from regional mines and local workshops controlled by the elites. This fascinating 2022 study examined 68 individuals from a site called La Almaloya and compared their DNA, radiocarbon dates, and archaeological contexts to understand kinship practices in El Argar society. They discovered that elite marriages were organised patrilocally. That means women moved to new towns to marry husbands who stayed put in their ancestral settlement. These people practiced reciprocal female exogamy, meaning the men sent their daughters and sisters off to neighbouring and distant settlements to be married there, and these settlements were ruled through patrilineal descent, meaning authority passed down father to son through the generations. They found evidence for pedigrees that extended up to 5 generations along the paternal line. They looked at the double burials, where an adult man and woman were buried together, within a few years of each other at least, which at some sites can be 20% of the burials, and found that they were married couples. Well, what they call unrelated mating partners. And in 3 cases, these marriages had offspring also buried here, who could be tracked with DNA testing. It never ceases to amaze me that they can do this kind of thing now, it's incredible. And they could also see that some men had children with more than one woman, suggesting either that a man could marry more than one woman at a time, or that they married a second time after the first one died. The status of women in this society has been much discussed because some women had these extraordinarily rich graves and some had these incredible silver diadems. I think they've found 5 now. Some argued that women were equals or even in charge in El Argar society. The reasoning was that women often had a greater quantity and variety of grave goods. Also, there are more women interred than men. And in the standardised burial rite, girls were given grave goods at an earlier age than were boys, suggesting they were considered to be women at an earlier age than their brothers. But the DNA evidence suggests a profoundly male-oriented society. The men were where the power resided, and their blood was tied to the land. As for the grave goods, it looks like with double burials, earlier grave goods were removed from the previous burial before the second one was put in. So if a man died and then a few years later his wife died, his stuff was partly cleared out and she was buried on top with all her finery. And perhaps the symbols of male authority were just simpler, the weapons with which he maintained his position in society, his position and that of his bloodline. These weapons were not just symbols. Analysis shows that all of them have signs of use wear. They were all used for fighting. The weapons we call halberds were developed somewhere in Belbeka Europe and spread from Ireland to the Carpathians. Maybe the style of fighting they required was especially effective and difficult to master, suitable for aristocrats rather than peasants. And maybe they also thought of it as the weapon of their ancestors. Eventually though, copper halberds were replaced by a clearly superior technology, the bronze sword. There are bodies showing wounds too, including one with a depressed skull fracture where a halberd was smashed into his head, which was probably protected by a leather helmet. Perhaps warfare also explains why more women were buried than men. More of the men were killed in fighting away from the home settlement, their bodies unrecoverable, and perhaps girls became women at a younger age because they could be married off sooner. while boys had to be strong enough to hold their own in battle before their coming-of-age ceremonies could be held. Despite it being a patriarchal society, elite women were undoubtedly held in high regard. One woman with a silver diadem was buried with her husband at La Almaloya beneath what's been described as a great hall. Not a home, but a huge meeting space, with benches lining the walls. I can well imagine both the king and the queen holding court here with the aristocracy sworn to them, making decisions on resource redistribution, local justice, marriage alliances, long-distance trade expeditions and warfare, before they were ultimately buried together beneath the structure. Maybe I'm just being simplistic, but how can a woman who wore a silver crown in death not be respected and powerful in life? La Almaloya was a compact, dense settlement that archaeologists say looks just like what are called palace complexes in the eastern Mediterranean, like Minoan palaces, for example. They were the cultural and economic power centres of the elites, where they could store resources, oversee workshops, and exercise power. It's not clear how much direct contact they had with contemporary state-level societies in Europe and across the Mediterranean, but certainly there were trade links, because they imported things like ivory from Africa and the eastern Mediterranean and amber from the Baltic. As the centuries progressed, these proto-urban centres gradually extended their political and economic control until at the peak they held authority over 33,000 square kilometres, basically the whole of southeastern Iberia. And their cultural influence extended even beyond that, where it looks like local elites tried to emulate El Agar on a smaller scale. However, at around 1550 BC, the El Agar way of life came to an end. It's not totally clear why, however, some settlements were burned down at this date and were never reoccupied. Surely in some cases then, there was a violent end. We know from genetic testing that they were not conquered and replaced by outsiders, as their ancestors had conquered this land, so the violence must have come from within. Perhaps war waged between the settlements or uprisings by the lower classes who could no longer be controlled. What may have sparked such conflict is that centuries of intense farming in this dry landscape eventually exhausted the environment, leading to food shortages and social collapse. Over the centuries, this culture had focused increasingly on the production of barley as its principal food source. Previously they'd grown wheat and pulses too, and they'd consumed flax, olives and figs, although it's not known if they were cultivated or wild. Why would their agriculture have become a monoculture over time? Well, there's an argument that ancient states, like in Egypt and Mesopotamia for example, could only arise due to their utilisation of cereal grains specifically. Grains can be grown, transported and stored as a kind of taxation and divided and redistributed by those who controlled them. Control of grains and the control of people were inextricably linked, resulting in a peasant or slave class tied to the land. And that's what we see in the El Agar culture. Barley is well adapted to water shortages, ideal for an area with little rainfall, and can grow in soils with medium to low fertility. It had low and variable yields, but those problems could be countered by constant land clearances and a sufficient labour source. I wonder how much of the conflict in this society was related to raiding for slaves. However, unlike in Egypt and Mesopotamia, there were no regular river floods to regenerate the soil for thousands of years. And in just a few centuries, after about 1900 BC, successive barley harvests exhausted the soils. The system might have faced a final blow from a drought around 1600 BC, which may or may not be linked to the knerrir volcanic eruption in the Aegean. The actual collapse probably took generations, with sites being abandoned over a period of decades before the way of life finally came to an end. The elites in their hilltop palace complexes might have lost control of the lowlands, whose people moved away from the region. Their political and economic systems had been so integrated that as they broke down, the elite way of life could no longer be sustained, and eventually, many of the hilltop sites were abandoned as well. Where they went, we can't yet say for sure, although there are suggestions that some elites tried to set up Ugaritic-type settlements further to the north. Some of the old hilltop sites continued to be occupied, but it's clear that the complex, state-level society had ended. There was now no division between distinct social classes. There were no more specialised workshops where multiple workers or slaves ground flour, weaved textiles, or hammered metal. Instead, work was carried out within the homes. Social organisation had become flatter again, with resources distributed more evenly. There were no more magnificent burials. Life was on a smaller scale, with smaller settlements and more diversity between them. People ate a wider variety of food, including more hunted animals. Central control over economics and culture had come to an end, and by about 1550 BC, the Elargar culture was no more. You know, the more I read about the Argaric culture, the more I was reminded of a contemporary society in Central Europe that I've mentioned many times on this channel, the Unatika culture. They also existed between about 2200 to 1600 BC. They also descended in part from the Belbeka culture. They used bronze halberds and they had unbelievably wealthy elite burials. They might also have been a highly organised state-like society, and they had an enormous influence on European history. They deserve a video too, so please subscribe now if you want to see that one in future. Remember, if you want to find out more about your own ancestry with MyHeritage, please use the link in the description and be sure to use the coupon code DAN, D-A-N, for free shipping. And there's that added bonus where you can get a 30-day free trial of MyHeritage's best subscription for family history research. This is also a great way to help support the channel and the work I do here. Now, to find out more about the Belbeka culture as it relates to Britain, please watch this video on the remarkable burial of the Amesbury Archer. Thank you for watching. The Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete is world famous for the enormous building complexes we know as palaces and for its exquisite art, expressed in lovely pottery, figurines and in frescoes of the most exquisite beauty. The Minoans were also great seafarers. Their ships reached across the Mediterranean to engage in trade with the civilizations of the Near East, importing exotic luxuries like date palms and pomegranates, and exporting wine and saffron. Talented Minoan artists even found work in foreign courts, for instance painting frescoes at Avaris in Egypt. Their artwork is famous for its depiction of beautiful women wearing lavish clothing and jewellery, of ritual processions and other exciting ceremonies. These luxurious, sophisticated scenes, along with the apparent lack of high walls around settlements, led many to believe that the Minoan civilization was a remarkably peaceful society. However, is this narrative, this perception of a peaceful Bronze Age Crete, actually true? Considering the fact that violent conflict is a feature of all societies around the world, past and present, is it even plausible that a wealthy civilization could develop or be maintained without the widespread threat and use of force? But what does the evidence tell us? Are there any signs of fortifications in Bronze Age Crete? Is there any Minoan artwork showing weapons and warriors? Can we tell anything from injuries on skeletons? And what about all those Minoan daggers, swords, spears and axes in the archaeological record? This is the story of weaponry and warfare in Minoan Crete.
Hvorfor reservere bordet ditt eget hjem? Kanskje fordi du får 100 kroner rabatt hos Fodora? Perfekt når familiens klovn har show i stua. Og da sto jeg der med 100 kroner rabatt rett i denne! Fodora, for de har lyst. Your next adventure begins at your doorstep. With your e-bike, you can extend your boundaries, discover new paths.
You know, I get hundreds of comments on my channel every month. I'm grateful for all of them, by the way, and I'm always surprised by how often people say my videos help them to relax and take a break from the stresses of their lives. It seems quite a few of you even put these videos on to fall asleep to. No judgment, by the way. But if you're feeling stressed, if you're dealing with anxiety, or if you're facing other personal challenges or mental health issues, then maybe talking to someone about these problems could really help. I have therapists in my family, and I know the value of the support that professionals have, and you're something you think should. Thank you. So who were the Minoans? where did they come from? Well, the island of Crete was populated during the Neolithic after about 7000 BC. Analysis of ancient DNA from human remains shows that the farmers living here originally came from nearby Anatolia, and they continued to grow crops and graze animals here for thousands of years. The Neolithic people lived in open villages on the fertile lowlands, and they gradually, over millennia, grew in technological sophistication. Now, there is a history of fortified settlements in the Aegean going back to the early Neolithic, most famously perhaps the sites of Sesklo and Dimini in Thessaly on the Greek mainland. These two sites, rather close to one another, were defended by impressive stone walls and baffle gates meant to slow and funnel attackers. And there's evidence from Neolithic Greece that shows violence was inflicted on people. For example, at one site alone in southern Greece, an analysis of 161 bodies showed that 13% had suffered depressed skull fractures, indicating that they'd been smashed in the head with clubs or maybe whacked by sling bullets of stone or baked clay. But what does all this have to do with violence in Bronze Age Crete? Well, this is just to establish the fact that the Neolithic Aegean was a violent place with violent people. What we call the Minoan civilization developed out of the earlier Neolithic population living on Crete, along with an additional late Neolithic migration from Anatolia. The people of the Bronze Age Aegean had a history of violence going back thousands of years, and no one claims that neighbouring Bronze Age societies in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia and Syria were peaceful either. So how did the popular notion of peaceful Minoans ever come about in the first place? Well, it was largely due to the British archaeologist Arthur Evans, who excavated for years on Crete from 1900, uncovering the so-called palace at Knossos, naming the Minoan civilization after the legendary King Minos, and defining it as something distinct from the Mycenaeans on the mainland. Over a century of academic work has been carried out since then, and many of Evans's interpretations have been challenged and overturned. However, the initial framing by Evans of the Minoans as peaceful, flower-loving artists has prevailed, at least in the public consciousness, and it's not hard to see why. The initial excavations were focused on Knossos, and the artifacts, and especially the frescoes there, portray flowers, animals, and beautiful, sexy women, rather than warrior kings. The author Rodney Castleton sums up the traditional view in his 1990 book on the Minoans, quote, "This firmly established 20th century tradition has it that the Minoans were talented, subtle, luxury-loving, worldly, sophisticated. They were sensitive, elegant, and graceful. They loved refined and sumptuous decor, beautiful art objects and jewellery. They loved peace and the rule of law, detesting tyranny and warfare. They had no personal ambition, a trait inferred from the complete anonymity of artists, sculptors, rulers and military leaders. There were no boastful lists of great achievements or conquests, and no monumental portrait statues of kings of the type found in Egypt." And he goes on, "One of their most outstanding traits, the tradition has it, was their love of peace, the pax minoica, spreading effortlessly as a result of pure and massive cultural superiority across the Aegean Sea. The Minoans' strength at sea was so great that they had no need to fortify their Cretan cities at all. None of them had defensive walls." End quote. We'll come back to the artistic tradition shortly, but first let's consider that central argument to the peaceful Minoans tradition, the apparent lack of fortifications surrounding palaces and settlements. The traditional view for Crete is that the lack of walls around Minoan sites means they had no fear of being attacked and therefore lived in a peaceful society. But the trouble with this line of reasoning is that it's just not true. Starting in the early Minoan period, about 2650 to 2200 BC, many sites were established in highland areas, their locations probably chosen with defence in mind. Because Crete is a very rugged landscape, the topography itself formed natural defensive units that were exploited by the careful siting of settlements. And there are known fortified sites too. There's a Middle Minoan era hilltop site dating to around 2000 to 1800 BC that overlooks the north coast of Crete with a substantial circular defensive wall. There's another similar mini-fortress settlement to the west along the coast, just about visible from it in fact. And it's possible that these two were part of a chain of coastal forts. In fact, one argument for the supposedly peaceful nature of Minoan Crete is that the island was defended most of all by sea. The sea itself was a barrier that protected it from attack. The Minoans were great sailors, and their ships would have likely been manned by men who would have had to defend themselves from attack at sea and in foreign lands. For much of history generally, there was often a fine line between trading and piracy, and voyages could turn from one form to the other when necessary. The classical Greeks remembered the ancient Cretans as a thalassocracy, their power coming from ruling the seas. Clearly, the existence of coastal fortresses suggests this domination of Mediterranean trade also required the use of force. But of course, people had been crossing the Aegean for thousands of years, and enemy landings would have been repulsed on land. The topography of Crete itself meant that there were limited avenues to move armies, especially if chariots and wagons were also used for transport and warfare. And control of these routes led to the Minoans establishing guardhouses along the Bronze Age roads. Dating from about 1800 to 1400 BC, there are about 169 known guardhouses, or guard stations, that shows the elites controlled the movement of people and goods through the landscape. And these guardhouses would have presumably been manned by soldiers, guards who had the authority to use force as part of their job. So we know there were special buildings with at least a partial military function. And as for the settlements themselves, some academics have argued that archaeological excavations on Crete have only rarely looked at the perimeters of major urban centres. If more excavations were done on the outskirts, perhaps more defensive structures would be found. Even so, archaeologist Stella Chrysoulaki lists multiple Minoan settlements with probable defensive works, with fortification walls and towers, including at Knossos and Malia. Throughout its long existence, the Minoan civilization went through various phases of stability and disorder, reflected in the settlements that were successively established, destroyed, rebuilt, abandoned, and so on at various times through the centuries. All this activity might indicate competition and conflict between elites, as groups expanded, conquered others, and were conquered or collapsed in turn. Destruction at sites in Crete was frequently followed by abandonment, which could be evidence of massacres or entire populations being enslaved by conquerors. Many destruction layers are also characterized by extensive fires. At the beautiful site of Moklos, now a tiny island just off the coast of Crete, excavations uncovered masses of charred human remains in a late Minoan house, interpreted as the remains of those killed during a sack of the settlement. It's clear that the archaeology of settlements in Bronze Age Crete does in fact suggest the elite used force to protect themselves and, at times, to wage destructive wars on each other. But if war was part of Minoan life, why did they not show it in their artwork? Women were more commonly featured in Minoan art, but men were also depicted carrying out a range of activities such as hunting, boxing, bull leaping, marching, processions, archery, and posing with weapons. These are presumably depictions of elite Minoan males engaging in the activities that helped to define them as a class. Hunting and sports are of course typical aristocratic pursuits that are great fun in and of themselves, but also serve as excellent training for war. While many weapons can serve as tools for hunting rather than war, the men wearing the famous boar's tusk helmets and holding large shields can only be interpreted as soldiers. Although I should say that these are often said to be scenes of rituals or processions rather than battle itself. But the presence of warriors rather suggests the existence of warfare. But the relative lack of battle scenes doesn't necessarily mean war was a rarity too. Minoan artistic expressions had various cultural purposes, and frescoes just might not have been considered the right medium for depicting violence. As Charles Gates points out in his 1999 article, "Why are there no scenes of warfare in Minoan art?" Quote, "There is no correlation between the practice of warfare and the choice of warfare as a pictorial theme." End quote. There are a few random fragments from Knossos of men throwing spears or running with them. One of these reassembled fragmentary scenes was named the Captain of the Blacks by Arthur Evans, who interpreted it as an image of a Minoan officer leading an imaginary troop of African subordinates. It would be easy to mock Evans for imposing his early 20th century British imperialist interpretation onto this fragment, but we should remember that despite their best efforts, every generation of archaeologists inevitably does the same kind of thing. Martial imagery appears more commonly in the form of seal stones or seal rings. These items were worn, and so were ornamental as well as functional objects that reflected the worldview of their owners more than did the frescoes. Many seals feature men holding spears or marching with them, but some feature men fighting with daggers or swords and shields. There are also many hunting scenes depicted, again reinforcing the link between the aristocratic pursuits of hunting and warfare. Then there's images on stone vessels, like the chieftain cup from Agia Triada, featuring two men armed with a spear and a sword. There's been much debate over the meanings of the scene being depicted, but its martial nature is obvious. And these are clearly well-muscled and well-groomed and ornamented elite warriors. There's also the boxer Raiton, also from Agia Triada, depicting muscled men boxing and bull leaping. The fact that some of the boxing men are wearing helmets reinforces the idea of sports as training for warfare. Bull leaping is seen as primarily a ritual activity, but clearly it was also an appropriate, dangerous, vigorous physical activity for elite men, along with boxing, hunting, and warfare. Further links can be drawn between ritual or religious activity and warfare in Minoan society by looking at sacred sites. They used sacred caves and what are called peak sanctuaries, as in mountain peaks, to carry out rites that often involved leaving votive offerings. These offerings could include clay figurines of people and animals, but they also left miniature weapons at the peak sanctuaries and model weapons that were made to be offerings, and actual functional weapons were also left at cave sites. These real or model swords, spears and axes, and small clay figures of armed warriors were symbolic offerings relating to warfare. Perhaps warriors made offerings before combat to get right with the gods, or gave thanks for victory after successful battles. We can assume there was a god or gods of warfare, and perhaps a smith god for metal workers specializing in weapon manufacturing. Throughout Bronze Age Europe, we find weapons primarily as grave goods in burials and also in bronze hoards, when weapons and other metal artifacts are buried in the ground or placed into rivers or bogs as offerings. In Bronze Age Crete, however, for much of their history, the Minoans didn't have a tradition of spectacular, chiefly burials that we see in other places, or of burying large bronze hoards. It doesn't mean there were no powerful warrior lords in life, just that this wasn't expressed with extravagant warrior tombs in death. Perhaps they believed in a peaceful, idyllic afterlife where men could finally be free from war. Maybe the tools of war were passed down from father to son, or the valuable bronze items were returned to the collective ownership of the elite-controlled armories for continued use. Human remains from Bronze Age Crete do sometimes display trauma inflicted by weapons. The bones of men and women show damage from swords, spears, axes, arrowheads, and possibly sling stones. Of course, injuries like this could be from murders or executions too, but considering everything else we know, it's likely many wounds were suffered in war. And there are in fact so-called warrior burials from later Bronze Age Crete, where individuals were buried with daggers, axes, and/or spears. As these post-date the probable Mycenaean conquest of Crete, these have long been interpreted as the graves of Mycenaean conquerors or mercenaries, but it's just as likely they were Cretans embracing new concepts of burial. The supposed relationships between Mycenaeans and Minoans has helped form the dominant perceptions of both societies. It was imagined that the warlike Mycenaeans started out being employed as mercenaries by the peace-loving merchant Minoans, only for the Mycenaeans to eventually turn on their former masters to conquer and rule over Crete from about 1450 BC. Of course, there is truth to this narrative, and Mycenaeans did conquer Crete, at least it seems that way to me. But the martial influences did not only go one way. In fact, it was the Minoans who were at the forefront of military technology. Over 80% of bronze objects from early Bronze Age Crete are weapons, and 73% of all known early and Middle Bronze Age Aegean daggers come from Crete. Sword technology seems to have spread from Crete to the mainland, and then to the workshops of the Bronze Age Carpathians in Central Europe, where sword technology underwent further independent development for centuries until it was perfected and spread back to the Aegean. The early Minoan period saw the gradual development of metal daggers, the weapons growing longer and more robust over time, until there's little doubt they were used entirely as specialist combat weapons. However, it could be argued, in fact it is often argued, that daggers were primarily general-purpose tools and hunting weapons. However, when Minoans developed their first swords by around 1800 BC, there can be no doubt that they were tools for combat only. The earliest form, known as Type A, was possibly inspired by those in the Near East and Cyprus, but it might also have been an independent design. After all, once you've developed long daggers, it's not much of a conceptual jump to sword length. However, it required advanced metalworking skills to manufacture functional long blades. And the Minoan workshops continued to develop and improve their sword designs for centuries, making them increasingly effective. Different sword designs reflect different fighting styles. You can imagine the basic idea just from looking at them. Long pointy ones were made for thrusting, while broader blades were better for slashing. There's far more complexity in practice, of course, and designs evolved to meet changing martial practices and defensive technologies. Boar's tusk helmets were developed by Minoans and feature in their artwork. These were made by sewing boar tusk plates, made by cutting flat sections from boar tusks onto a leather backing. They were effective as armour, and perhaps had symbolic purposes too, calling on the strength and ferocity of the wild boar itself, and that dangerous aristocratic pursuit, the boar hunt. Minoan warriors also employed large body shields, rectangular or figure 8 shaped, from at least 1800 BC or so, right through to around 1200 BC. These were made from a wicker frame and tough rawhide, perhaps also holding symbolic value, considering the popularity of bull imagery in Minoan art and the pastime of bull leaping. They also developed body armour, possibly made from metal plates like the Mycenaean dendra panoply, although it's not clear how widespread it was, nor if they used leather armour too. But considering the metallurgical skill of the Minoan workshops and the wealth of the island, which by all accounts was greater than on the mainland, I think it's likely Minoan metal armour was employed in battle. You can see in artwork that spears were important military weapons, and although the early ones were rather simple and could have been hunting weapons, later heavier spears had complex designs. It's rather likely, judging by their mass and geometry, that some were designed for punching through armour. Now, one of the most famous icons of Minoan Crete is the double axe, sometimes called the labris. You will see this described almost everywhere as a purely symbolic object, associated only with rituals that had nothing to do with warfare, and many examples are indeed miniature versions or overly large ones made from sheet metal. But as we've seen, Minoans made model versions of all their real functional weapons, and in fact the majority of double axes known are the functional cast copper and bronze forms. Some of these are inscribed with the martial symbols of boar tusk helmets and figure 8 shields. So it's likely that Minoan warriors fought with double axes, probably in close quarter fighting, and they used them just like axes from later periods were used, for reaching over shields to strike the head, and for hooking the top of the shields to pull them down, to break up shield formations, and to create an opening for a neighbouring comrade to strike with a sword, spear or bow and arrow. Contemporary Mycenaean images of battle show this kind of combined arms fighting, with archers fighting amongst shielded spearmen, for example. The Minoan weaponry workshops continued to produce weapons after the Mycenaean conquest. In fact, Mycenaean Linear B tablets from Knossos list numbers of swords and spears, as well as men who likely served as guards and others who were foreign mercenaries. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC or so, new expressions of warriorhood developed, influenced by Central Europe and mainland Greece. that saw smaller shields and the now two-type sword spreading to Crete. However, local versions of these foreign origin swords were made by the ancient local workshops, adapted to local fighting styles. But the population decline on the island and the wider regional changes we call the Late Bronze Age collapse led to the end of the Minoan era by about 1000 BC. Most of the information for this video comes from two articles on the subject by Barry Malloy, and from the sources he lists in his articles. As with all my videos, the sources can be found in the description if you'd like to know more and to read about it from actual experts instead of me. Late Minoan warrior burials also featured the entire warrior package of weapons, jewellery, mirrors, tweezers and razors, as I describe in detail on my video on Bronze Age warrior beauty, so please watch that video now or check out my Bronze Age warfare playlist. Thank you for watching. These incredible golden cones are surely amongst the most spectacular and mysterious artifacts from Bronze Age Europe. Dating to between about 1600 BC and 800 BC, they look so strange as to almost be absurd. They recall the pointed hats of stereotypical witches and wizards. Only these ones, dating to over 3000 years ago, are made from shining gold. Beautifully decorated with impressed bands, dots and circles, there are 4 known examples found in France and Germany. They would fit nicely on a person's head, and so are collectively known as golden hats. The tallest of them is an impressive 90 centimeters or 35 inches, and so when worn as a hat would make quite a remarkable impression. But who would have worn them and why? Were they made for and worn by powerful individuals like Bronze Age kings, perhaps as spectacular crowns? Well, to understand these 4 objects, we need to look at them in the context of Bronze Age Europe, their technological advancements, the gods they might have worshipped, and especially how their beliefs and practices were reflected in their material culture. So how were these special artifacts made? What did the designs on them mean? Could they be related to the widespread and long-lasting Bronze Age solar cult, religious practices relating to the movements and power of the sun, and to the transition of the soul to the afterlife? And could they even have functioned as complex, sophisticated calendars? This is the wonderful story of the mysterious golden hats of Bronze Age Europe. This video is sponsored by Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one management software that provides you with a range of applications to simplify the day-to-day management of your business, whatever its size, including invoicing, accounting, project management, website creation, and much more. The Odoo project application offers comprehensive and flexible project management that allows you to track progress, deadlines, and resources, and collaborate in real time. You can create tasks and subtasks to break down complex projects, assign people to set deadlines, schedule activities like calls or meetings, and more. Odoo centralizes collaboration within any task, allowing you to send emails, attach files, and log notes directly through the chatter, keeping everything organized in one place. You can choose the project view that best suits your workflow. The Kanban view organizes tasks by stages, like sticky notes, for a clear and intuitive overview. The Gantt view gives you a timeline to visualize task dependencies and deadlines. The list view displays all your data and lets you respond to but it's 900 BC and 800 BC. Throughout the Bronze Age, the various societies of Europe, from the Atlantic to the Aegean, and from Scandinavia to Iberia, constructed stunning objects that were technologically innovative and artistically sophisticated. But there are just 4 surviving golden hats, also called golden cones, that have been discovered so far. The golden hat of Schifferstadt was found near Speyer and the River Rhine in 1835. It's dated to perhaps 1600 BC. The Aventon gold cone was found near Poitiers, France in 1844. It's dated to between about 1500 to 1200 BC. The golden cone of Iseldorf-Buch was found near Nuremberg in 1953, and this one is dated to about 1000 to 900 BC. It's the tallest known gold hat at 90 centimeters or 35 inches, And finally, the Berlin gold hat was probably found in Swabia or Switzerland, but it was acquired by a museum in Berlin in 1996, hence its name. It's also thought to be the latest example at around 1000 to 800 BC. When metal artifacts are found in situ by archaeologists, sometimes organic material found in and around them can be radiocarbon dated to provide dates for their burial. However, none of these hats was excavated using modern archaeological techniques. The dating for them has instead been estimated by experts based on things like the metalworking techniques and motifs used, which can be compared to a corpus of known and dated gold work. People have been digging up precious ancient things for centuries, but it's only in recent times that archaeologists are sometimes called in to record things properly. The context of finds is extremely important in understanding how, why, and when they were buried. But in this case, it's only with the hat from Schifferstadt that we have some description of how it was in the ground. It was buried upright in a pit, resting on a slab of burnt clay, along with 3 bronze axes that were buried leaning against the cone of the hat. There was no sign of a human burial, and so it almost certainly wasn't part of the burial goods for a powerful ruler. It doesn't seem to have been the crown for a Bronze Age king. Likewise, the golden cone from Iseldorf-Buch was likely buried upright, but no one noticed it during the removal of tree stumps when it was broken in the ground by digging tools, and then ripped up and thrown away until someone rescued the pieces. No one knows for sure where or when the Berlin gold hat was discovered, as it only came to notice when it was put up for sale in the 1990s. It had been in a private collection until then, but its good condition suggests it may also have been carefully buried upright. The private collection that owned it was in Switzerland, so it's reasoned that the hat was found in that region or in southern Germany. This would also be consistent with the style of decoration. If all the dating is accurate, it would mean the hats came from a tradition alive in Central Europe for as long as 800 years. But actually, it was likely practiced across a wider geographical area. There was an artefact known as the Chromaford crown, discovered on the Devil's Bit mountain in County Tipperary, Ireland in 1692. Not a cone like a wizard hat, but like a bowl with a brim, perhaps like a low-rise version of the Schifferstadt gold hat. On its discovery, this precious artefact was going to be melted down for its value in gold, but an Anglo-Irishman named Joseph Chromaford bought it and saved it. At least, saved it long enough for it to be recorded and described, before being lost to history. It's likely it was eventually melted down for its value in gold by one of Joseph's descendants after the family moved to France. It makes you wonder just how many other precious golden objects from Bronze Age Europe were discovered by farmers and treasure hunters over the centuries that were likewise melted down before ever being recorded. It's a wonder really that we have anything at all. And there are other contemporary objects that are not cones and have no brims and have often been interpreted as ornate golden bowls that could perhaps have actually been golden hats. The helmet of Liero from Atlantic Galicia dates to about 1000 to 800 BC and is decorated with the same motifs as the golden cones from Central Europe. It also has a tiny cone, like a spike, on top, or the bottom, depending on how you look at it. There are also 2 more examples from the Basque country in the hills near Bilbao. Dating from the same era, these were interpreted as bowls, which, as they have no brims or cones, makes sense. But again, the motifs are so similar that some think perhaps they were hats, or perhaps they could have been used as both. There are other golden bowls from Iberia and elsewhere in Bronze Age Europe that are clearly not hats, so it's hard to say for sure. But we can say that although we only have 4 golden cones surviving, there may have been a more widespread tradition, perhaps taking local forms in different areas. It's worth noting that some of these golden bowls, or hats, display a star-shaped motif emanating from the centre, just as on the top of the tall golden cones, as if representing the sun's rays bursting forth from the crown. This motif is even seen on a wooden bowl or cup from the Nordic Bronze Age, where the star shape was made by embedding many tiny pins of the silvery-coloured valuable metal tin. There's no doubt the people who made these great hats were masterful gold workers. These towering cones were shaped starting from a single ingot of gold, which would have been just a few centimetres in diameter. These huge artefacts weigh between just 285 grams and 490 grams. The Berlin cone is also reinforced around the bottom with a 10mm wide strip of bronze sheet, but the gold of these hats is extremely thin, The Berlin example averages just 0.6 millimeters in thickness. To stand up so tall and to have been usable, they would have been reinforced with a lining of some kind, perhaps stiff leather that long since rotted away. To transform the lump of gold alloy into these towering shapes took incredible skill, delicately hammering, or rather tapping, with perhaps stone, bone, antler, wood or bronze tools over a series of forms, gradually flattening out and extending the gold into these shapes. Hammering changes the quality of the metal, and it would soon grow brittle and crack if it were not repeatedly and carefully annealed by heating it to the right temperatures. The bands and symbols were impressed onto the surface by stamps, perhaps carved from wood. Imagine how careful and precise you would have to be to do this successfully. These techniques are similar to those used to create the mould cape from Wales, dating to slightly earlier in the Bronze Age, perhaps 1900 to 1600 BC. Also hammered from a single gold ingot and impressed with stamps, it was also originally attached to an organic lining, and bronze strips may have strengthened it further. The concentric bands and embossed shapes are similar to those motifs seen on the golden hats, and I would expect they represent some of the same ideas and practices. You can imagine someone important. In the case of the mould cape, it would have likely been a woman due to its small size, wearing this item during special ceremonies, the polished gold shining and the many angles flashing the reflected light of the sun as she moved and turned about. But what archaeological evidence is there for the importance of the sun in Bronze Age society? The hats are incredible, striking and unusual items. However, they are part of broader cultural traditions from across prehistoric Europe. In particular, the complex series of practices, sometimes called the Bronze Age solar cult. The ancient European fascination with the movements of the sun was expressed in the Neolithic in the form of monumental structures like Stonehenge in England and great tombs like Maes Howe in Scotland and Newgrange in Ireland. Parts of these ancient structures were precisely constructed to align with the rising or setting sun at special times of the year like the summer or winter solstices. These were profoundly important times in the annual cycle. Moments of change in the wheel of time, as the sun reached its peak in power on the longest day, grew weaker through the second half of the year, and was reborn again after the darkest day of winter. This concern with the return of the sun was surely felt more deeply in Northern Europe, where the winter days were so short, and long winters could freeze the very earth for weeks on end. Creating permanent monuments required a human, earthly power, harnessing communal efforts to shift stones and earth, as well as the power of knowledge and the ability to know the future. Exactly setting the stones at Maes Howe in Orkney so that the light of the midwinter setting sun shone into the tomb marked the death of the year and its impending rebirth. The stones and the people who built them made a connection between the death and rebirth of the sun and the death and rebirth of the ancestors, of human souls as individuals, and so celebrated and reinforced the longevity of the community. Marking these moments created a connection between the realms of the earth and the sky, a temporary bridge between the sun and the stones, a kind of harnessing of the life-giving power of the sun. As the population of Europe changed through large-scale migrations at the end of the Neolithic and the development of the Belbeker culture, the use of large monuments continued at sites like Stonehenge and Pomelta in Germany, and new monuments that related to the movements of the sun continued to be created in the landscape. But along with new people, cultural practices, social structures and metalworking technologies came new ways to express these relationships with the sun. The early Belbeker period in Western Europe, from about 2500 BC onwards, brought with it goldworking, and some of the earliest gold artefacts here are small sun discs found along the Atlantic coasts from Britain and Ireland through France to Iberia. These miniature suns often feature decoration in the forms of circles around a central cross. This ancient solar symbol would continue to be seen throughout the Bronze Age. The circle being the sun, and the cross could reflect the cardinal directions, the shine of the sun's rays, like in a winter sundog at dawn, and divide the eternal recurring year of the circle into 4 seasons. In these early sun discs, the patterns also feature repeating dots or lines, perhaps conveying the sun's rays or the days within a year. probably sewn onto clothing or burial shrouds, these were perhaps related to concepts of rebirth through the rising and setting sun, and the dying and reborn year, and the dying and reborn soul. We'll talk more about this later. Gold was the perfect material for a society entranced by the sun. The polished surface of the material seemed to somehow capture and reflect back a fraction of its power. Found in gold-rich locations throughout Europe, likely in the form of nuggets and flakes washed from highland deposits by rivers and streams, you wonder if they also conceived of it as in some way solidified sunlight sent down from the heavens to the earth. This substance was also transformed by heat and light, and the art of the metalworker into increasingly complex and beautiful forms throughout the Bronze Age. Dating to around 2200 to 1900 BC, over 100 beautiful gold lanulae have been found mostly in Ireland and also southern Britain and Brittany. These very thin golden ornaments were worn around the neck, and the flat, shining surfaces would have flashed the reflected power of the sun from the chest of the wearer. Maybe 1,000 years later, goldwork and Bronze Age society had developed so far that much heavier golden collars were made, known as gorgets. Where the older, flat lanulae were decorated with inscribed triangular patterns, these later ones were more three-dimensional, with impressed lines and punched forms, and with even finer concentric circles. Perhaps objects like this were worn by elites as displays of their wealth and power, or perhaps they were related to the solar cult. Decorations on the ancient lanulae are often similar to those inscribed on bell beaker pots, which were also related to rites of transformation, death, and rebirth. As well as wearable golden artifacts, Bronze Age European master craftsmen constructed ritual objects from metal that were also related to the solar cult. The most famous example is the Trundholm sun chariot. Dating to 1400 to 1300 BC, it is a bronze horse on 4 wheels, pulling a great bronze disc mounted on a 2-wheel carriage. One side of the disc was covered in ornate gold. This magnificent artifact was discovered in a bog on the Danish island of Zealand in 1902. The farmer who ploughed up the pieces assumed it was an old toy and gave it to his daughter to play with. It was eventually recognised as an ancient ceremonial object depicting the sun chariot being pulled across the sky by a cosmic horse. We can see that it had a function as a ritual object, as the golden side shows a sun being pulled from left to right, or from east to west, just as the sun moves daily through the sky. The opposite side has no gold, and so represents the night sky or perhaps the moon. We can imagine then a ritual where the movements in the heavens were reenacted here on the earth, facilitated by priests and accompanied by appeals to the heavens, recitation of special words, perhaps chanting song, and the sound of the great bronze lyres dating to this era. Depictions of rituals are seen in the rock art of Bronze Age southern Scandinavia, where men hold aloft great curving axes and spears, along with solar symbols and thousands of carvings of boats. The journey of the sun across the sky was associated archaeologically not only with a horse pulling it in a chariot, but in other kinds of vehicles, like boats and wagons, and in association with other kinds of animals, like the sun deer seen as far away as Iberia, and especially swans. In Central Europe, the so-called bird-sun boat motif is seen repeatedly in various forms. Water birds, as creatures of the air, the land, and the water, were able to move between the realms of heaven and earth, and between this world and the afterworld, which was often accessed through water. We even see models of solar boats with wheels, powered by birds and even commanded by human-bird hybrids, perhaps representing gods, like the Dawn Goddess, or spirits serving as guides. This was the ultimate Bronze Age spiritual amphibious vehicle. The archaeological evidence points to a belief in the daily journey of the sun across the sky by chariot, before it lands and descends into the earth or underwater, where it was damped or dimmed. The sun then journeys through the underworld in darkness, perhaps carried by a night ship from west to east, before rising again to be drawn through the heavens once more. In a changeable world, the eternally repeating daily and annual solar cycles were life's only certainty. The sun's journey across the heavens and into the underworld was perhaps linked to the transition of the human soul from this world into the next. Just as the sun was carried by horses, birds and boats, so the soul was escorted across the realms to the afterlife, to one day be reborn like the sun, carried in the vessel of the womb, before emerging back into the world. Solar motifs relating to the heavens, featuring birds, horses or boats, are seen in goldwork on artefacts like golden bowls with horsehead handles from Denmark, in the many bronze sun discs worn by women of the Nordic Bronze Age across their womb in life and in burial, again demonstrating the sun's association with death and rebirth, and in the famous knerrir sky disc from Central Europe dating to 1600 BC with its golden sun and golden solar boat. This ritual item was buried along with 2 swords with golden inlays on the handles and 2 axes. We must remember this recurring motif of twinned weapons along with the sun. The archaeological evidence shows us these kinds of motifs and associations, but what can ancient mythology and folk stories tell us about the Bronze Age solar cult? When trying to understand the beliefs of pre-literate Bronze Age Europe, attempts have been made to reconstruct them, at least to some extent, by looking for clues in later records of mythology from the various descendant Indo-European societies. There were various deities linked to the sun, and there are common motifs associated with them. For example, famously the Greek god Apollo, associated with the sun, travelled every winter to Hyperborea on a chariot drawn by swans. Greek mythology and deities themselves were often influenced by non-Indo-European societies of the Eastern Mediterranean, but the underlying importance of the ancient sun god tradition shines through. Other familiar Greek sun deities, like the female Eos and the male Helios, her brother, convey something of the complexities of Indo-European sun worship. Eos was a manifestation of the goddess of the dawn, who would rise each day and hand the sun off to her brother, who would carry it across the sky in his chariot. In Indo-European traditions, different aspects of the sun would have specific deities representing them. Comparative mythology and linguistics have reconstructed the Proto-Indo-European dawn goddess as Hausos. She was the daughter of the Sky Father, the daylight sky, and she was associated with the golden yellow and red colours of the dawn, the rising sun. And her name, Hausos, comes from a Proto-Indo-European root word meaning to shine or glow. This is the same root that underlies the Proto-Indo-European word for gold. Her historically recorded descendant deities tended to be associated with a vehicle like a carriage pulled by oxen or horses, or by birds like swallows or swans, or a silver or golden boat. In Baltic and Slavic mythology, the dawn goddess travels in her boat beneath the earth to the underworld, the place where the dead reside for the dark of the night, before emerging once again in her eternal rebirth. A common motif is her daily reluctance to emerge into the world for various mythological reasons. Often she does not wish to leave her lover's bed and must be coaxed or forced from it. In many mythologies she's associated with horses, and as with her Greek incarnation Eos, she has a sibling, or more often 2 siblings, the horse twins, also known as the divine twins. They were the youthful brothers who pulled the sun chariot across the sky riding or driving 2 horses, or were the horses themselves. They were young men and warriors, travellers and sailors, usually found rescuing the goddess and others from the water. Mallory and Adams in the Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture say the following, quote, "It was the widely attested belief that the horses of the sun traversed the sky during the day in a pursuit of their consort the morning star. The divine twins, the sun god and his daughters, the morning and evening stars, would rest at the end of the day on the islands in the Western Sea. At night, they would return to the east in a golden boat." End quote. Those islands in the west were also the islands of the dead, to where the souls of the deceased travel and reside. You can see then the mythology and the archaeology aligning to tell us something about the belief systems of the people in this era. Panels of Nordic Bronze Age rock art from southern Scandinavia show scenes portraying the journey of a day boat through the sky and a night boat travelling back through the underworld. But how does all this relate to the form and functions of the golden hats? How might they have been used in ritual activities related to these beliefs around the sun and the afterlife? Rituals can be carried out for many reasons, like honouring specific gods and observing natural cycles like the seasons or the changing states of the sun or moon. Just like today, there were rites of passage between different states of being for birth, marriage and death, and the transitions between youth and adulthood. These activities would be accompanied by musical instruments, singing and chanting, and by dancing. Rites could be accompanied by offerings or sacrifices, giving up a portion of or the whole of something precious to the gods, whether beer or milk, parts of an animal, or even people. Rites could be common and small scale, happening daily and carried out alone or in a small family group, or they could be enormous events, attended by hundreds or thousands of people, occurring only once a year, or once a generation, or only on the death of a truly great person, or some magnificent achievement. The forms of rituals could recreate the stories of mythology on Earth, acted out by priests or participants, or witnessed by an audience. From what we know of the solar cult, it seems likely rituals involving the golden hats were carried out to honour the dawn goddess, and especially in relation to death and rebirth. Perhaps also in marking the seasons, and perhaps to honour the departure or safe arrival of travellers, who in most cases would have been warriors. Ritual activities are featured in artwork at a special burial mound known as the King's Grave in southern Sweden. This was an enormous stone structure dating to the 15th century BC, containing burials surrounded by stone slabs with many fascinating motifs. One of these slabs appeared to display 2 spears and 2 axes, with a Bronze Age boat beneath, and what is surely a tall, conical golden hat with a wide brim in the centre. The axes are depicted with curving handles, as if they are leaning towards the hat in between them. Here we can see the golden hats clearly associated with, central to, in fact, other symbols associated with ritual activities in Bronze Age Europe to do with the sun, journeying, and specific ritual weapons in pairs. Academics have pointed out the similarities between this image from Bronze Age Sweden to the ritual deposition of the hat from Schifferstadt, which, if you recall, was found buried upright, with 3 axes leaning against it. It seems likely then that the hat was buried in a manner reflecting its ritual use. Before we talk more about the rituals, we must first address whether these hats were more than beautiful objects to be worn and displayed to reflect and recall the light of the sun. There are some people who believe at least 1 or 2 of the hats in fact functioned as lunar solar calendars. Research on the Berlin hat especially has concluded that the different bands and symbols encode mathematical information about the regular movements of the moon and the sun through the year. If true, this would be an extraordinary feat of mathematical and astronomical complexity for a pre-literate society 3,000 years ago. There are different numbers of rings around the raised bosses in different bands. And in one band there are crescent symbols and eye-shaped symbols that could be representations of the moon in different phases. It seems possible these artistic choices could be interpreted as representing different phases of the solar and lunar cycles. But I am highly sceptical that it functioned as a lunar solar calendar. The calculations required to decode it seem dubiously complex, while at the same time any imprecision is waved away as Bronze Age incompetence. And these calculations don't apply to the other examples. It seems likely then that their actual function was for use in ritual activities related to the sun. The details of how these rituals took place are hard to determine from archaeology because brief acts performed by people don't tend to leave much evidence behind to be found. As well as comparative mythology and the archaeological record of gold and other objects, we also have limited figurative artwork from Northern Europe depicting, amongst other things, ritual activities. The meanings of the various images shown on the slabs in the King's Grave in Sweden are hotly debated. Some see them as a narrative of heroic achievements in the life of the man interred in the primary burial, others that they portray coming-of-age rites, or perhaps the complex burial rites themselves. So it's not clear, but we do see motifs of vehicles like chariots and boats, animals like horses, and processions of human-bird hybrids, or perhaps hooded people in robes, and the sun wheel or solar cross. There are also people raising axes and bronze lures into the air, and there's also some sort of potentially rotating device that may represent the sun and the moon. We're also blessed with the tens of thousands of images on the open-air rock art of southern Scandinavia, showing figures engaged in various activities, including raising ritual axes to the sky. And we know these kinds of axes specifically were made for ritual and not war, because they're actually quite thin bronze, cunningly cast around a clay core. We know for sure that complex metal objects could be made specifically for ritual use. Bronze Age rock art is an incredibly complex subject, with different traditions practiced in different regions of Scandinavia for over 1,000 years, but we can see activities involving boats, animals, axes and spears, bronze lures, and motifs representing the sun. The various iterations of the solar cult found throughout Bronze Age Europe over centuries or millennia would also have had different kinds of ritual practices in different places. But from the evidence we do have, we can assume that the activities took place at special ritual sites. There's not much evidence for specific ritual buildings like temples in this era, although there are some. For example, timber structures beside burial mounds with evidence of occasional small fires and animal bones where rituals might have been carried out and sacrificial offerings made when communing with the ancestors. Nevertheless, one would expect that solar rituals would take place in the open air, perhaps at stone or timber circles or enclosures, especially those with alignments relating to solar events. Rituals generally take place in delineated spaces, physically separated from the everyday world, even if these spaces are only temporarily marked out. It could be that some rituals took place in the landscape. I'd imagine these would be hilltops, open hillsides facing south or towards the rising sun, or on the sea shore as the sun rises. And the time of year and time of day was surely of vital importance. Perhaps they took place or started or ended at sunrise or sunset, or at midday. Perhaps grand events occurred at the solstices or equinoxes, or perhaps they could happen throughout the year in association with other important events like the birth of an important child or the death of a great chieftain. Who might have carried out these rituals? Well, due to their immense value, it's believed the golden hats would have been worn by either priests or chieftains. In many societies, you can have both a priestly class of ritual specialists, but also see leaders like chiefs leading rituals themselves as representatives of the tribe to the gods and/or as representing the gods to the tribe. There is a theory that the hats might not have been worn at all. They might have been considered the headwear of a god and held aloft or placed on a platform, representing the presence of a god for the ritual. In the rock art of Bronze Age Europe, there's a common motif of a pair of feet carved into the rocks. Some people think these might indicate the presence of a god standing amongst the ritual activity. Others have suggested they were markers where actual priests or chiefs stood on the flat rock surfaces while rites took place. In fact, it could be both at the same time. Many rites, speaking generally here, were reconstructions on Earth of ancient mythological events practiced by the gods and heroic ancestors. Perhaps when standing in specific places during certain rites, the priests or chiefs were transformed and temporarily became the gods or ancestors themselves. Likewise, the wearing of the golden hats could have transformed the wearers into the gods as their representatives for the duration of the rites. It's widely believed the golden hats were likely not constructed for specific individuals or owned by them as property as such. Certainly, we have not found any in the many thousands of burials known from the era. People were often buried with valuable metal items, like jewellery for women and weapons for men, personal objects that they wore and used in life, and would carry with them into the afterlife. As far as we know, however, none were buried with golden hats. It seems they weren't considered personal property, or at least were not the proper kind of artefact for burial with people. And there's an intriguing group of artefacts from Scandinavia, Austria and Italy during the Bronze Age that links tall hats, solar symbols and priests. Bronze Age Sardinia is also known as the Nuragic civilization. The degree of Indo-European linguistic and religious influence on the island is debated, and they certainly had their own unique ritual practices and unique temple sites. They also made many small cast bronze figurines with wonderful details intended to be votive offerings. These included animals and warriors, and also many figures portraying priests who wore tall, pointed hats. This suggests pointy hats were a symbol of the priestly class, or were worn by people who conducted rituals. They probably aren't supposed to be made from gold though, they're probably leather or felt or something. But what priests did in non-Indo-European Sardinia would have little relevance for the rest of Indo-European Europe, or so I once thought. However, there was one group of bronze votive objects from Sardinia that were found deposited in Italy across the Tyrrhenian Sea. Along with a priest with a pointed hat, there was this strange miniature stool. This 5-wheeled stool seems to represent in miniature a type of artifact known from 2 full-size examples, one from Austria right on the border with Hungary and one from southern Sweden. These were about 1,000 kilometres away from one another, but the 2 locations are linked by the so-called Amber Road, the trade routes between the Baltic and the Mediterranean, along which precious amber travelled throughout the era. These 2 bronze objects are so similar they must have been made in the same workshop, or at least in the same region, likely Austria. There are 10 sun wheels around the sides, and the circular sheet of bronze on top is decorated with concentric bands of sun rays. Exactly what they are is debated. Some suggest they were supposed to be hit like a drum or a gong. It's more likely they were the top of a wooden stool. Some think it might have been sat on by a priest during solar rites. The diameter of the bronze disc is 43 centimetres or 17 inches. The miniature version has a small hole in the top, perhaps for another figure to be fixed on it. I wonder if a tall hatted priest might even have stood on top of it, with the stool and hat elevating them even more above the audience and closer to the sun. There are even some figures in the Bronze Age rock art of southern Sweden that seem to be wearing tall hats, along with a sun wheel and a large ritual axe. So here we have evidence for priests, tall hats and solar symbols all together. The dating of the golden hats is interesting. If they do stretch from 1600 BC to 1000 BC or even later, then they first emerge at the start of the Central European tumulus culture and continue to be made in the Urnfield culture, which emerges around 1200 BC. This is interesting because the most obvious difference between these 2 phases of the European Bronze Age is the mortuary ritual. In the tumulus culture, powerful people were buried lying in graves beneath burial mounds known as barrows or tumuli, hence the name. This was an Indo-European tradition dating back thousands of years to its origins in Eastern Europe. The later Urnfield culture, on the other hand, usually cremated the dead and placed the ashes and burned bones in large pottery vessels or urns and buried many of them together in flat cemeteries or burial fields, hence the name Urnfield culture. This change in mortuary practice is thought to represent a widespread change in the corresponding belief systems too, although exactly what is hard to say. Perhaps they started to think that sending the soul to the afterlife was best done through transforming the body into smoke and ashes. This new religion, if you could call it that, was incredibly popular and was taken up by multiple ethnic groups throughout Europe. So it's perhaps surprising that the golden hats, and presumably their associated rites, continue to be made and used across the 2 eras. Maybe this rite was simply that important and enduring, at least in certain areas. Perhaps there were many gold hats made, maybe even dozens or hundreds, or maybe there was only ever a few precious ones. Either way, they were surely passed on through generations, perhaps controlled by the priestly class until it came time for them to be buried in their final ritual. We see evidence for various kinds of ritual activity in the bronze hoards and ritual deposits found from this era. Bronze hoards are groups of metal objects, like swords, axes and jewellery for example, found buried together in the earth. The way the objects were treated before and during the depositions often shows these were careful, deliberate acts. Swords, for example, were often deliberately bent and bound together before being sunk into a river or bog. Axe heads might have been smashed into pieces after being heated to a specific temperature range before being buried. These kinds of depositions were likely the result of communal ritual activities full of meaningful actions for the participants. Broken and bound swords buried at the conclusion of a peace treaty between warring tribes, or weapons won in battle being given to the gods in thanks for victory. A unique object was buried in Central Europe in around 1600 BC at the end of the Unetice culture and the rise of the tumulus culture. This remarkable bronze disc with golden symbols has been called the world's first astronomical depiction of the sky, as it features the Pleiades constellation, the sun and moon, and a solar boat. It went through various changes during its life as a ritual object, eventually being mounted to something. Perhaps it was a piece of wood and was held aloft as a banner of some kind, a symbol of ancient power and wisdom, as well as ethnic or class identity. It was ritually deposited on a hilltop, along with 2 swords, 2 axes, and a chisel and bracelets. The form of the deposition may in some way reflect the ritual usage in life. Interestingly, the twin swords and twin axes reflect the twinned weapons seen in the king's grave and the axes buried with the Schifferstadt cone. It seems likely that at least in some instances, the solar rites using the golden hats included 2 or more weapons being held up beside or over them, held aloft by priests or young warriors over the head of the hat-wearing priest, the weapons demonstrating the presence of the divine twins, protecting the dawn goddess and projecting their power as warriors and saviours over her, and over the ritual participants. We must imagine too the fires, the speaking or singing of the sacred words, the drums and the sounding of the lyres, calling forth the reluctant dawn goddess into the world. Although details of the fine circumstances are largely unknown, all 4 surviving golden hats were deposited in the earth in the Bronze Age. That's why we have them today. They were all buried in the earth at the end of their active lives, so to speak. The people who used them decided for some reason that the time had come to stop using them and to put them into the ground. They did so, perhaps, in similar ways to how they had been used in life. Perhaps they did so rather than continue to use them because some change had occurred in their society. Maybe the lineage of priests or chiefs using them had ended. Maybe the ritual had failed in some way, and seasons of poor weather or a change in climate had led to crop failures. Maybe their belief systems changed, and new rites and objects were required. Or perhaps they were grand gifts to the gods, seeking some special favour or good fortune. These depositions were surely sacred rituals themselves, and we can imagine again scenes of priests and attendees in ritual clothing with bronze horns and singing as they were put reverently into the earth. It could have been done at sunrise in the presence of the dawn goddess, or perhaps it was done in darkness, lit only by fires, when she herself was residing in the underworld. It would make sense if it was also done in the dark of the longest night of the winter solstice. Could they have hoped their ritual depositions of the golden hats would spur the goddess into her eventual rebirth? If so, it's perhaps fitting then that they were eventually found and brought back into the light. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. Now, please watch this video about Nordic Bronze Age rock art and what it can tell us about ritual, masculinity and warfare in ancient Europe. Thank you for watching. On the 26th of October 1440, in a field outside the city of Nantes in the Duchy of Brittany, Gilles de Laval, the Baron of Ray, stood on a platform above a vast, silent crowd. Before them all, the great lord fell to his knees, folded his hands together, and begged for God's mercy. Beneath the platform, a mound of timber lay ready to be ignited. From the gallows above his head dangled the rope that would soon be placed about his neck. Once he had been one of the wealthiest men in the world, owning dozens of castles throughout the richest lands of Brittany, Maine and Anjou. He was a war hero and a marshal of France who fought alongside Joan of Arc to drive out the hated English invaders, helping to win the throne for King Charles VII. But Gilles de Rais had long harboured a darkness in his soul. During his scandalous trial, he had confessed to the most terrible crimes imaginable. The court would hear stories of alchemy and demon summoning, accusations of heresy, and the admission that the great lord and his accomplices had abducted, abused, and murdered countless children. But how did he spiral so completely out of control? How was he finally caught and prosecuted? And what about those who claim that he was, in fact, an innocent man, framed by a conspiracy of powerful lords who wanted his wealth for themselves? This is the shocking story of the famous night wealthy baron and serial killer Gilles de Rais. This video was made possible by my supporters on Patreon. This channel relies on the support of these generous people. If you enjoy these videos, please join us on Patreon to access exclusive content and to ensure I can keep making videos like this in future. Thank you. Gilles de Rais was born in about 1404 or 5, supposedly in the Black Tower of the castle of Champtocé on the banks of the Loire. His parents were Guy de Laval and Marie de Craon, who were second cousins, both part of an aristocratic clan that spread its influence across what is northwest France today, especially in Brittany, Anjou, Maine and Poitou. The union of Guy and Marie made them heirs to enormous fortunes that would pass to Gilles on their deaths. And both his parents had died by 1415, when Gilles was about 10 or 11 years old. His father Guy was gored by a wild boar when out hunting, and then he slowly died, likely due to an infection. Presumably, this was a traumatic period in Gilles' early life, which influenced the formation of his character. Some speculate that losing the moderating influence of his father started him on the road to uncontrollable madness. But Gilles himself claimed that he had always been raised as a spoiled boy. Gilles had a brother, René, who is commonly said to be 2 or 3 years younger. However, it's possible that he was in fact 10 years younger, and perhaps complications from his birth were responsible for their mother's death. We don't really know what happened to her though. She just isn't mentioned in any records after 1414 or so. Either way, the boys were not close, and René does not appear much in the story of Gilles' life, so perhaps he was in fact far younger. And not only were they not close, they were rather adversarial. Years later, René began legal proceedings to stop Gilles selling off the family's holdings to pay the enormous debts the older brother had accrued. Anyway, after they were orphaned in 1415, they were then raised by their maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon. 1415 is a famous date in French history because of their devastating, humiliating defeat at the Battle of Agincourt. And when Jean de Craon's son, Gilles' uncle, was killed at Agincourt, he made his grandson his heir instead. This made Gilles the heir to his father's titles and estates, and now those of his maternal grandfather. At around 11 years old, Gilles had become one of the wealthiest heirs in France. As he was a child, however, all this wealth, the titles and the lands and castles that came with them, remained in the control of his grandfather until Gilles came of age at 20. Now, Jean de Craon is generally seen as one of the villains of this story. In fact, some see him as a monstrous figure who proved a terrible, corrupting influence on young Gilles. One biographer called Jean de Craon, quote, rapacious, avaricious, greedy and unscrupulous, end quote. They say the old lord was a thug who believed himself above the law, a lord who used his henchmen to bully and threaten rivals and subjects, to extract wealth and to further his political interest. And there's no doubt he was a high-level political operator, dedicated to advancing his own wealth and influence through political bargains with his peers, subjects and the royal family. He was ruthless and yet cunning, able to give way and to compromise when it was in his interests. And yet he also went beyond the law when he could get away with it. There are multiple accounts of him kidnapping other nobles, men and women, and holding them captive to further his political and financial aims. And it would be exactly this kind of behaviour that would lead to Gilles' downfall years later. Where Jean de Craon knew when to back down, Gilles de Rais never learned to compromise. In 1415, when Gilles' father Guy de Laval was dying, he made arrangements for a different guardian for his children and their fortune. So Guy did not want Jean de Craon to control his children and their fortune, but it wasn't long after his death before Jean took over. As the guardian of Gilles and his brother René, he was responsible for their upbringing and education. Like all noblemen of the era, Gilles was raised to be a knight and a lord. His tutors instructed him in reading and writing French and Latin. He needed to understand the law and the administration of his lands, and his religious education was vital. His first tutors were both priests, one with a degree in law. But warfare and violence were a nobleman's primary responsibilities, and so he was trained in horsemanship, the sword and other weapons, armoured wrestling, and the whole business of fighting. And France had been at war for a long time against the English, but now it was also at war with itself. The Mad King Charles VI had often experienced bouts of severe psychosis, and the lack of leadership led to a civil war amongst the French nobility. After the devastating English invasion that culminated in the 1415 Battle of Agincourt, Charles eventually, in 1420, made Henry V of England his successor and gave his daughter in marriage to the victorious English king, disinheriting his 17-year-old son, the Dauphin Charles. Complicating matters, the great Henry V and the mad King Charles VI would both die in 1422. Henry V's son and Charles VI's grandson, the infant Henry VI of England, would be crowned King of France. Unsurprisingly, the former Dauphin Charles sought to gain the throne he believed was his, and soon the kingdom was divided between lands controlled by the English and those loyal to Charles. In 1422, Gilles was about 17 years old and was still under the control of his grandfather. They were focused on using the instability and shifting loyalties of the era to further their own local political interests. Gilles de Rais is closely associated with the Duchy of Brittany because he had inherited or later married into estates there. The barony of Rais was in the far south of Brittany, but he also had lands in counties within the royal domain of France, so his overlords were both the Duke of Brittany and the King of France. John V, the Duke of Brittany at this time, is an important character in the story of Gilles de Rais. He was the man ultimately responsible for Gilles' arrest and prosecution, and those who argue that Gilles was in fact innocent point to Duke Jean as the true villain. And Brittany was an important, powerful duchy. In the decades before Gilles' birth, at the start of what we call the 100 Years' War, the War of the Breton Succession became a proxy war between the kings of England and France. The prize was the Duchy of Brittany itself, and it had been won by the English-backed Montfort faction. The Duke now was John V of the House of Montfort. While his father and grandfather had relied on English support, John V played both sides for his own ends. It was in this period of shifting alliances, disorder and skirmishing that Gilles de Rais began his career as a soldier, first in local skirmishes and then against the English. In 1427, his rather elderly grandfather, Jean de Craon, was appointed Lieutenant General of Anjou, and as the role entailed levying and leading troops in battle, it was Gilles, aged about 22, who actually took command. And he employed some of his great wealth to raise 5 companies of soldiers. For the rest of the war, he was ever surrounded by a retinue of well-equipped, magnificently clad men-at-arms, especially 3 veteran knights who served as his military advisors. All his men he kept well supplied and well paid, which ensured their effectiveness in battle and their loyalty to him as their captain. In his first campaign, he took 3 towns and 2 castles from the English and their local allies. At the siege of Lude, after the cannon had blasted the walls, the signal was given to attack the garrison. It was a well-defended place, protected by a veteran garrison under a Captain Blackburn. After charging across the open ground beneath the walls and scaling the breach, Gilles de Rais was the first atop the wall. There he fought Captain Blackburn in single combat while the battle raged around them. Gilles de Rais cut down his enemy and the English morale was broken. It was a heroic victory, won through his remarkable personal bravery. This was an era where taking prisoners and ransoning them for cash was the norm. Indeed, it was an important source of income, especially for the less wealthy men. After this victory, Gilles de Rais ransomed the English prisoners, but to the disappointment of his men, he had all the French captives executed. Some biographers accuse Gilles de Rais of recklessness in this attack, and likewise these executions are seen as an early outward sign of his secret, bloodthirsty nature. It's more likely, though, that this was a calculated political move intended to frighten potential future collaborators. Flushed with victory, Gilles then attempted to take the town of Le Mans from the English, but they were repulsed by the garrison led by one of the greatest soldiers of the age, John Talbot, still early in his career in France. Though he failed to take Le Mans, Gilles de Rais returned from his campaign in triumph. He had made a name for himself on the battlefield and demonstrated that he was willing and able to employ his vast wealth in support of the Dauphin Charles and his efforts to win the throne. Gilles is said to have cut a dashing figure at the relatively impoverished court, and he was the only man amongst the courtiers rich enough to maintain a private army. As the biographer Jean Benedetti says, quote, "He was very popular at court. He was handsome, gay and witty, and he dressed better than anyone else," end quote. However, we have no idea what he looked like. There are no known contemporary portraits or descriptions. There are some near-contemporary images, but they are works of imagination. The most famous painting depicting him is from the 19th century. Whatever he looked like, he was young and making a name for himself as a soldier. He had attached himself to the cause of the disinherited prince, a cause which to many seemed doomed to failure. But now a miracle was coming. Gilles' life would become entwined with that of the saviour of France, the Maid of Orleans, Joan of Arc. The English and their allies controlled the lands north of the Loire, while the supporters of Charles controlled the south. It was a strategic stalemate, but the English decided to win the war by taking the stronghold of Orleans and then pushing south beyond the Loire to drive Charles out of his court in Bourges. It was a bold strategy, but if successful, the weak Charles, still known as the Dauphin, or more disparagingly as the King of Bourges, would have seen his support crumble forever. And in late 1428, the English marched unopposed to Orleans and began their siege. In February the next year, an attempt was made to relieve the town by an army of French and Scots, who fell upon an English supply column which was bringing ammunition and barrels of herring for the besieging army. Under attack, the English circled their wagons and then defeated the combined French-Scottish forces at what would be called the Battle of the Herrings. By the way, this battle and the Siege of Orleans feature in my novel Vampire Heretic, The Immortal Night Chronicles Book 5, which is about Gilles de Rais, his crimes and his trial, and Joan of Arc. If you'd like to read it or listen to it on audiobook, there's a link in the video description. The utter failure to relieve the siege was a terrible blow to French morale. Like in so much of the 100 Years' War, the French lacked clear leadership. There were many powerful dukes and great lords with their own contingents, and all of them wanted to be the overall commander in any particular engagement. They all wanted to be the great hero to save France, and so none of them were. And after this debacle, most of the French commanders abandoned Orleans to its fate. The would-be king, Charles, was with his court at Chinon, well aware of the situation, but doing nothing about the inevitable outcome. France needed a miracle. And that's exactly what it got. The court had word that a young woman was coming, a maiden, inspired by God, who had declared that she would raise the siege of Orleans and see the Dauphin crowned at Rheims Cathedral. When Joan was first brought into the court, Charles posed as one of his courtiers, and yet the maid somehow recognised him at once. There is a legend that during this dramatic scene, Gilles de Rais was the one seated on the throne, looking every bit the prince. However, while he was indeed at the court, this part is likely a later invention. The relationship between the evil Gilles de Rais and the saintly Maid of Orleans has been much embellished by legend and imagination. But it's true that Gilles was in overall command of the army that accompanied her to Orleans along with cartloads of supplies. A few days later, there was an impromptu attack on the English defences. The townsfolk had been driven into a righteous fury by the maid's presence, and while she was taking a nap, they charged the English lines. Of course, they were slaughtered and pushed back by an English counterattack. When Joan awoke and rode out, she led an attack on the English. Another English force was sent out, trapping Joan and her company between the two prongs. Sometimes Joan of Arc has been praised for her military brilliance, but really she had none. She had ridden straight into danger with no thought of the consequences and was about to be killed or captured. But Gilles de Rais, alerted to the sudden bizarre skirmish going on outside the walls, assembled the company and rode out to attack the English. Now it was the English forces who were caught between two prongs, and they chose to retreat. In the disorder, they left one of their siege forts poorly defended, and it was taken by the French. A complete disaster had been averted by Gilles' decisive actions. Gilles and the other captains recognised the maid's effect on morale, but her military incompetence led her to being excluded from the Council of War held the next day, even though they held it in the house she was lodged in. They decided that they would not follow up their small victory. Not only that, but they would also bar the gates so the foolish townsfolk would not throw their lives away again. Joan railed against them, and the next day led a pitiful attack against the strong English fort beyond the walls. She stood in her armour before the fort and planted her flag with a small band of inexperienced men destined to fail once more. But once more it was Gilles de Rais who rode out in support of her. After him, the French gradually grew in numbers and overwhelmed the English in the fort. After this victory, the captains once again urged delay and consolidation of what they had won. But Joan had found an ally in Gilles de Rais. She had no mind for politicking and strategy. All she understood was relentless attack and blind faith in victory. This attitude must have appealed to the reckless, bloodthirsty, narcissistic Gilles de Rais. The next day, they attacked another fort together, with the French forces trying to scale the walls. Joan was shot in the shoulder by a crossbow. Apparently, Gilles caught her, removed her a safe distance, and helped to remove her armour so the wound could be dressed. It should have been a terrible injury, but Joan was convinced she could not die until her mission was completed, and so she soon returned with Gilles to the fight. The masses of inspired Frenchmen overwhelmed the English fortress and they won a great victory. The English were baffled and disturbed by the sudden change in fortunes. The French had been driven into a frenzy by a maiden dressed in armour who was clearly in league with the devil. The English army packed up and abandoned the siege of Orleans. Gilles was amongst the leaders, perhaps foremost amongst them, who accompanied Joan back to the Dauphin Charles. She had delivered him the victory she promised, and now she urged him to be crowned king at Reims. But the victory at Orleans was more symbolic than strategic. Nothing had really changed. The English still controlled the north, and it would take a full campaign to win it back. In the Loire campaign that followed, Gilles was present at the capture of Jargeau and at the great French victory at Patay. When Charles went to be crowned at Reims, Gilles de Rais was one of the commanders of the vanguard of the royal army. During the coronation, Gilles was given the great honour and responsibility, along with 3 other lords, to bring the holy ampulla with its sacred oil for the anointing of the king. On the same day, Gilles de Rais was proclaimed a Marshal of France in recognition of his support for the king. He was not the greatest of the military leaders, or the most experienced, but he was perhaps the wealthiest, and he was willing to spend his fortune to support Charles. He was also from a region that Charles wanted to exert his control over. The title bestowed more honour than actual power. However, the new marshal also began to sit on the royal council from the year 1429. Records show that he only joined the council every now and then. One gets the sense that his positions were largely honorary, and he was never that close to the inner circle of the royal faction. Perhaps his character flaws were apparent to the great men of the realm, or perhaps he preferred to spend his time indulging other pursuits. After the coronation, the royal army advanced on Paris. During a standoff with the Anglo-Burgundian army, Gilles de Rais was given command of a wing of the royal army, but there was no battle. The enemy retreated and the French advanced on Paris. During the attack on the city, Joan requested that Gilles fight alongside her once again, and that he did, fighting in the great press to cross the siege works into the city. But Joan was wounded and the attack was defeated. The newly crowned King of France retreated from Paris and disbanded his army. He preferred to negotiate his way to a political solution. Joan's fanaticism and warmongering were not only no longer needed, they were an obstruction, even an embarrassment to Charles. The maid and her family were ennobled by the king as thanks, but she was then sidelined. The Maid of Orleans, however, was not willing to support peace and attacked the Burgundians with a force of incompetent volunteers. She was captured and moved from castle to castle. At one point, she leapt from a window of the tower she was locked in and smacked into the dry moat below. Her captors found her injured and carried her back inside. Soon they sold her to the English, and she was tried by a French bishop in an ecclesiastical court. While she was in prison in Rouen over the winter of 1430, Gilles de Rais was in a small town just a few miles away. He was there with a company of soldiers, and it's been suggested he was preparing a rescue attempt. If that's true, for whatever reason it was not carried out. Gilles went home, and on the 30th of May 1431 she was burned at the stake for being a lapsed heretic. The Maid of Orleans might have been the only female Gilles was ever really close to. How he felt about the death of his former comrade in arms, we don't know, but it's from this time that Gilles starts to become more publicly unhinged. Many changes occur one after the other, and his life turns from one of glory, fame, and virtue to darkness, disgrace, and sin.